I know I'm starting. Okay, sorry. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so we're gonna try this again tonight. Still continuing the January 6th coverage stuff. Coverage stuff. Stuff coverage. I'm gonna leave off where we leave off. No, I'm gonna start off where we left off. I don't know what's wrong with you tonight. Okay, I'm gonna start where we left off last night. We were about an hour into the January 6th insurrection hearing. At least one of the hearings. There was many of them. It went on for a long time. So, but I'm gonna start with the same video that we were watching last night. And then hopefully some people come in. If anybody wants to come up and discuss this, I will post the link in the chat. If anybody wants to join to come on and talk about your thoughts about all of this. January 6th, was it an insurrection or not? What do you think about it? What do you think about the riots, Trump's immunity, and all of that? So here's the link. Sorry. Okay. So there it is. There's the link. If anybody wants to come up and talk about this, because the week before I went away for my little birthday vacation, there are a bunch of people debating me about this in the chat. So I wanted to open that up to anybody. But for now, we're just going to keep on watching this January 6th hearing. So let me bring that up. All right, let me see. What's the best way to do this? I can't decide. Like this? That? No. Maybe this. Okay. All right, let's get into it. I'm going to rewind just a little bit because they played a helpful video where we ended last time, so I'm going to start from there. The Congress member from Arizona, I believe he's a Congress member. Anyway, he's some Arizona government official, state government official in Arizona, who had Trump's people reaching out to him to help him try to set up these fraudulent electors and certify them, to ultimately steal the election on January 6th when the vote was being certified. So this guy Bowers was testifying about that, where we left off. All right, let's just start it from about the hour mark, 1 hour in.
And be challenged. Documents produced to the Select Committee show that the Trump campaign took steps to ensure that the physical copies of the fake electors' electoral votes from 2 states were delivered to Washington for January 6th. Text messages exchanged between Republican Party officials in Wisconsin show that on January 4th, the Trump campaign asked for someone to fly their fake electors' documents to Washington. A staffer for Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson texted a staffer for Vice President Pence just minutes before the beginning of the joint session. This staffer stated that Senator Johnson wished to hand deliver to the Vice President the fake electors' votes from Michigan and Wisconsin. The Vice President's aide unambiguously instructed them not to deliver the fake votes to the Vice President. Even though the fake elector slates were transmitted to Congress and the executive branch, the Vice President held firm in his position that his role was to count lawfully submitted electoral votes.
Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes.
Which is what he did when the joint session resumed on January 6th after the attack on the Capitol.
538.
What we just heard in that video was an aide to the White House Chief of Staff telling this committee that the White House counsel's office felt that this fake electors plan was not legally sound. Nevertheless, the Trump campaign went forward with the scheme anyway. Speaker Bowers, were you aware that fake electors had met in Phoenix on December 14th and purported to cast electoral votes for President Trump?
I was not.
When you learned that these electors had met and sent their electoral votes to Washington, what did you think? That video was an aide to the White House Chief of Staff telling this committee that the White House counsel's office felt that this fake electors plan was not legally sound.
I think that was part of the
Nevertheless,
video.
the Trump campaign went forward. White House Chief of Staff telling this committee that the White House counsel's office felt that this fake electors plan was not legally sound. Nevertheless, the Trump campaign went forward with the scheme anyway. Speaker Bowers, were you aware that fake electors had met in Phoenix on December 14th and purported to cast electoral votes for President Trump?
I was not.
When you learned that these electors had met and sent their electoral votes to Washington, what did you think?
Well, I thought of the book, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And I just thought, this is a tragic parody.
I was saying this last night. This guy is very
that as you flew from
poetic.
Phoenix to Washington yesterday, you reflected upon some passages from a personal journal that you were keeping in December 2020 while all of this was taking place. With your permission, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share one passage in particular with us.
Thank you very much. It is painful to have friends who have been such a help to me turn on me with such rancor. I may, in the eyes of men, not hold correct opinions or act according to their vision or convictions, but I do not take this current situation in a light manner, a fearful manner, or a vengeful manner. I do not want to be a winner by cheating. I will not play with laws I swore allegiance to, with any contrived desire towards deflection of my deep foundational desire to follow God's will as I believe He led my conscience to embrace. How else will I ever approach Him in the wilderness of life, knowing that I ask this guidance only to show myself a coward in defending the course He let me take. He led me to take.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those are powerful words. I understand that taking the courageous positions that you did following the 2020 election
Very poetic.
in defense of the rule of law and protecting the voters of Arizona resulted in you and your family being subjected to protests and terrible threats. Can you tell us how this impacted you and your family?
Well, as others in the videos have mentioned, we received, my secretaries would say, in excess of 20,000 emails and tens of thousands of voicemails and texts, which saturated our offices and we were unable to work, or at least communicate. But at home, up till even recently, it is the new pattern or a pattern in our lives to worry what will happen on Saturdays, because we have various groups come by and they have had video panel trucks with videos of me proclaiming me to be a pedophile and a pervert and a corrupt and politician, and blaring loudspeakers in my neighborhood, and leaving literature both on my property, but arguing and threatening with neighbors and with myself. I don't know if I should name groups, but there was one gentleman that had the 3 bars on his chest, and he had a pistol and was threatening my neighbor, not with the pistol, but just vocally. When I saw the gun, I knew I had to get close. And at the same time, on some of these, we had a daughter who was gravely ill, who was upset by what was happening outside. And my wife, that was a valiant person, very, very strong, quiet, very strong woman. So it was disturbing. It was disturbing.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for your service to the state of Arizona and to the country. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I think it'd be appropriate to take a short recess. Accordingly, I reserve the balance of my time.
What about this hat?
The chair requests that those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members and witnesses from the room. We'll have 5 minutes, 5-minute recess.
A match? Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna get serious now. All right, there's a recess. Let's obviously skip the recess.
For being here today. You've been a public servant in Georgia since 2015, serving first as a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, and then, since January 2019, as Georgia's Secretary of State. As a self-described conservative Republican, is it fair to say that you wanted President Trump to win the 2020 election?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Secretary, many witnesses have told the Select Committee that Election Day, November 3rd, 2020, was a largely uneventful day in their home states. In spite of the challenges of conducting an election during a pandemic, you wrote in the Washington Post that the election was, quote, successful. Tell us, what was your impression of how Election Day had proceeded in Georgia?
On Election Day in November, our election went remarkably smooth. In fact, we meet at the GEMA headquarters. That's the Georgia Energy Emergency Management Association meeting location, but we were following wait times in line. In the afternoon, our average wait time was 3 minutes statewide that we were recording for various precincts, and it actually got down to 2 minutes. And at the end of the day, we felt that we had a successful election from the standpoint of the administration and the operation of the election.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Raffensperger, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election in Georgia, and by what margin?
President Biden carried the state of Georgia by approximately 12,000 votes.
And Mr. Secretary, as I understand it, your office took several steps to ensure the accuracy of the vote count in Georgia, reviewing the vote count in at least 3 different ways. These steps included a machine recount, a forensic audit, and a full hand recount of every one of the 5 million ballots cast. Did these efforts, including a recount of literally every ballot cast in the state of Georgia, confirm the result?
Yes, they did. We counted the ballots with the first tabulation would be scanned. Then when we did our 100% hand audit of the all 5 million ballots in the state of Georgia, all cast in place, all absentee ballots, they were all hand recounted, and they came remarkably close to the first count. And then upon the election being certified, President Trump, because he was within 0.5%, could ask for a recount, and then we recounted them again through the scanner, so we got remarkably the same count. 3 counts, all remarkably close, which showed that President Trump did come up short.
Nevertheless, as you will see, the president and his allies began making numerous false allegations of voter fraud. The false allegations that you and Mr. Sterling, among others, had to address. Mr. Sterling, thank you also for being here today. Following the 2020 election, in addition to your normal duties, I understand that you became a spokesperson to try to combat disinformation about the election and the danger it was creating for elections officials, among others.
Well, I guess I would
In a
need the
December
total
1 press
amount of
conference, you
votes.
addressed some of your remarks directly to President Trump. Let's take a look at what you said that day.
Let's see.
Mr. President, it looks like you likely lost the state of Georgia. We're investigating. There's always a possibility. I get it. You have the rights to go through the courts. What you don't have the ability to do, and you need to step up and say this, is stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. And it's not right. It's not right.
Okay, so
Mr. Sterling, what prompted
this guy who was just talking, he is about to testify right now. He's the third man sitting at this table.
you to make these remarks?
Mr. Schiff, we had a previously scheduled press conference
This
that
guy,
day, as we were
Mr.
in
Sterling.
the habit of doing, trying to be as transparent as we could about the election and the counts going on. A little after lunch that day, lunchtime, I received a call from the project manager from Dominion Voting Systems, who was oddly, audibly shaken. She's not the kind of person I would assume would be that way. She has a master's from MIT, a graduate of the Naval Academy, and is very much on the ball and pretty unstoppable. And she informed me about a young contractor they had who had been receiving threats from a video that had been posted by some QAnon supporters. And at that point, we had been steeping in this kind of stuff. So it was around us all the time. So I didn't take note of it more than adding to the pile of other stuff we were having to deal with. And I did pull up Twitter and I scrolled through it and I saw the young man's name. It was a particular tweet that, for lack of a better word, was a straw that broke the camel's back. Had the young man's name. It was a very unique name. I believe it was a first-generation American. And it said, had his name, "You committed treason. May God have mercy on your soul," with a slowly twisting gif of a noose. And for lack of a better word, I lost it. I just got irate. My boss was with me at the time, the Deputy Secretary, Jordan Fuchs, and she...
See, and this is only just some of the rhetoric, right, from the right that people have been complaining about recently, because supposedly the left's rhetoric was to blame for Trump getting shot by a registered Republican. So I don't even understand that part, but this is why people were like, what? Why am I gonna apologize? This has been going on for so long and it's been very extreme. It's not just like sharing nooses and talking about hanging congressmen and women and breaking into their houses and trying to kidnap them and attacking them with hammers. And there's been a whole bunch of crazy threats and even attacks that have come from very extreme Trump supporters. So and this Republican official from, I'm sorry, I don't know their actual positions in government, but I just know he's from Georgia. He's a government official, and he fucking lost it because it was just mounting and mounting and mounting. And also he knew it was all unnecessary because all of the allegations of voter fraud and election fraud have been proven again and again and again to be non-existent. They were investigated, and Trump and his people continue to spread this lie that the election was stolen from him. And it was creating tension and chaos and, a recipe for violence. Unnecessarily.
You could tell that I was angry. I tend to turn red from here up when that happens, and that happened at that time. And she called Secretary Raffensperger to say, we're seeing these kind of threats, and Gabe thinks we need to say something about it. And the Secretary said yes, and that's what prompted me to do what I did. I lost my temper, but it seemed necessary at the time because it was just getting worse. And I could not tell you why that particular one was the one that put me over the edge, but it did.
Now, after you made this plea to the president, did Donald Trump urge his supporters to avoid the use of violence?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, as we know, the president was aware of your speech because he tweeted about it later that day. Let's take a look at what the president said. In the tweet, Donald Trump claims that there was, quote, massive voter fraud in Georgia. Mr. Sterling, that was just plain false, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
Nevertheless, the very next day, on December 2nd, President Trump released a lengthy video again making false claims of election fraud in Georgia. Let's take a look at what he said this time.
They found thousands and thousands of votes that were out of whack, all against me.
In fact, the day after Donald Trump released that video, so now we're talking just 2 days after the emotional warning that you gave that someone's going to get killed, representatives of President Trump appeared in Georgia, including Rudy Giuliani, and launched a new conspiracy theory that would take on a life of its own and threaten the lives of several innocent election workers. This story falsely alleges that sometime during election night, election workers at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, Georgia, kicked out poll observers. After the observers left, the story goes, these workers pulled so-called suitcases of ballots from under a table and ran those ballots through counting machines multiple times. Completely without evidence, President Trump and his allies claimed that these suitcases contained as many as 18,000 ballots, all for Joe Biden. None of this was true. But Rudy Giuliani appeared before the Georgia State Senate and played a surveillance video from State Farm Arena, falsely claiming that it showed this conspiracy taking place. Here's a sample of what Mr. Giuliani had to say during that hearing.
And when you look at what you saw on the video, which to me was a smoking gun, powerful smoking gun, well, I don't have to be a genius to figure out what happened. And I don't have to be a genius to figure out that those votes are not legitimate votes. You don't put legitimate votes under a table.
No.
Wait until you throw the opposition out, and in the middle of the night, count them. We would have to be fools to think that.
President Trump's campaign amplified Giuliani's false testimony in a tweet, pushing out the video footage. Giuliani likewise pushed out his testimony on social media. As you can see in this tweet, Mr. Giuliani wrote that it was, quote, now beyond doubt, unquote, that Fulton County Democrats had stolen the election. Later in this hearing, we'll hear directly from one of the election workers in this video about the effect these lies had on her and on her family. Mr. Sterling, did the investigators in your office review the entire surveillance tape from the State Farm Arena on election night?
They actually reviewed approximately 48 hours going over the time period where action was taking place at the counting center at State Farm Arena.
And what did the tape actually show?
Depending on which time you want to start, because as was mentioned, this conspiracy theory took on a life of its own, where they conflated a water main break that wasn't a water main break and throwing observers out and a series of other things. What it actually showed was Fulton County election workers engaging in normal ballot processing. One of the specific things, one of the things that was very frustrating was the so-called suitcases of ballots from under the table. If you watch the entirety of the video, you saw that these were election workers who were under the impression they were going to get to go home around 10:30. People are putting on their coats. They're putting ballots that are prepared to be scanned into ballot carriers that are then sealed with tamper-proof seals so that they can, they're not messed with. It's an interesting thing because you watch there's 4 screens of the video, and as you're watching it, you can see the election monitors in the corner with the press as they're taking these ballot carriers and putting them under the table. You see it there. One of the other hidden ones, if you look at the actual tape, was on the outside of the table, just from the camera angle. You couldn't see it originally. And this goes under the no good deed goes unpunished. We were told that we were at GEMA, as the secretary pointed out, and we were told that it looked like they were shutting down the Fulton County counting. The secretary expressed some displeasure at that because we wanted to everybody keep counting so we could get to the results and know what was happening. So our elections director called their elections director, who was at another location because this was election day. There was 2 different places where ballot things were being done by the Fulton County office. So he called the elections director of Fulton, then called Ralph Jones, who was at the State Farm Arena, and said, what the heck are you doing? Go ahead and stay. And as you watch the video itself, you see him take the phone call as people are putting things away, getting ready to leave. And you can tell for about 15, 20 seconds, he does not want to tell these people they have to stay. He walks over, he thinks about it for a second, you see him come back to the corner of a desk and kind of slumps his shoulders and says, okay, y'all, we got to keep on counting. And then you see him take their coats off, get the
They're talking about that video that Trump and his people were spreading around that allegedly showed the suitcases that were full of uncounted ballots. That the people were pulling out from under the table, and it was supposed to show election fraud. This was a very popular video that Trump and his people were spreading, and it was all a lie. And that's what this guy, Mr. Sterling, is explaining here right now.
The ballots out. And then a secondary thing that you'll see on there is you'll have people who are counting ballots who a batch will go through, they will take them off and run that through again. What happens there is a standard operating procedure. If there's a misscan, if there's a misalignment, if it doesn't read right, these are high-speed, high-capacity scanners. So 3 or 4 will go through after a misscan. You have to delete that batch and put it back through again. And by going through the hand tally, as the secretary pointed out, we showed that if there had been multiple ballots scanned without a corresponding physical ballot, your counts would have been a lot higher than the ballots themselves. And by doing the hand tally, we saw 2 specific numbers that were met. The hand tally got us to a 0.1053% off of the total votes cast and 0.0099% on the margin, which is essentially dead on accurate. Most academic studies say on a hand tally you'll have between 1% and 2%, but because we use ballot marking devices where it's very clear what the voter intended, it made it a lot easier for us to conduct that hand count and show that none of that was true.
Now, I understand that when you reviewed these tapes and did the analysis, it disproved this conspiracy theory. But you still had to take a lot of steps to try to make sure the public knew the truth about these allegations. And you did frequent briefings for the press. Let's take a look at one of those press briefings, Mr. Sterling, that you held on December 7th to make the point that you just did today.
Move on to what I'm going to call Disinformation Monday. So out of the gate, many of you all saw the videotape from State Farm
Disinformation
Arena.
Monday.
I spent hours with our post-certified investigators, Justin Gray from WSB, spent hours with us going over this video to explain to people that what you saw, the secret suitcases with magic ballots, were actually ballots that had been packed into those absentee ballot carriers by the workers in plain view of the monitors and the press. And what's really frustrating is the president's attorneys had this same videotape. They saw the exact same things the rest of us could see, and they chose to mislead.
This is the important part. They had this videotape and they saw everything that, as he said, the rest of them could see. So they were purposely spreading this misinformation and this conspiracy. So when people say, like, oh, well, you know, what if Trump legitimately believed the election was stolen? This is evidence that he knew it actually wasn't, but he continued to spread this. He wanted to spread a conspiracy intentionally.
State senators and the public about what was on that video. I'm quite sure that they will not characterize the video if they try to enter into evidence, because that is the kind of thing that could lead to sanctions, because it's obviously untrue. They knew it was untrue, and they continue to do things like this.
Mr. Sterling, despite the efforts by your office to combat this misinformation by speaking out publicly and through local media, you were unable to match the reach of President Trump's platform and social media megaphone spreading these false conspiracy theories. What was it like to compete with a president who had the biggest bully pulpit in the world to push out these false claims?
For lack of a better word, it was frustrating. But oftentimes I felt our information was getting out, that there was a reticence of people who needed to believe it because the President of the United States, whom many looked up to and respected, was telling them it wasn't true, despite the facts. And I characterized at one point it was kind of like a shovel trying to empty the ocean. And yes, it was frustrating. I even have family members who I had to argue with about some of these things, and I would show them things, and the problem you have is you're getting to people's hearts. I remember there's one specific, an attorney that we know that we showed and walked him through. This wasn't true. Okay, I get that. This wasn't true. Okay, I get that. This wasn't 5 or 6 things. But at the end, he goes, I just know in my heart they cheated. That's just.
Listen to that. What he just said. He said he was showing an attorney, and he was showing him and walking him through the video and showing him things, telling him things about why this isn't true. This video with the magic suitcase, or the secret suitcases with magic ballots, none of that is legit. None of that's true. And the attorney goes, I just know in my heart the election was stolen. So, when people are saying facts over feelings and liberals are always arguing with their feelings and shit, this is a perfect example of conservatives doing just that. They're making judgments with their feelings and not the factual information, because in their heart they just wanted to believe Donald Trump so badly because they believe in him so much for whatever fucking reason. They just couldn't imagine a politician lying to them. Is it because Trump wasn't originally a politician? He was a shady businessman? Does that make it any difference? What about Donald Trump is relatable? The fact that he was born into a millionaire, trust fund baby in Manhattan, is that relatable to most country folk? I don't know. But yeah, people to this day still believe the election was stolen. So, even after all of this, and I know this probably isn't the most popular channel that has posted these January 6th hearings, but this video, for example, has 505 views. And I saw some of the more popular channels. Like, here, watch live January 6th hearing, 170K views. That's still not a lot. Day 2 of January 6th hearing, almost a million. But yeah, not many people know this information or care to know. And then they just go on and, you know, make these claims, make these ridiculous claims. And it's all based on feeling. And just like believing what Donald Trump and his followers and supporters have been spreading.
And so once you get past the heart, the facts don't matter as much. And our job, from our point of view, is to get the facts out, do our job, tell the truth, follow the Constitution, follow the law, and defend the institutions and the institutions held.
Let's take a look at what you were competing with. This is the former president speaking in Georgia on December 5th.
Evidence of fraud is overwhelming. And again, I'm going to ask you to look up at that very, very powerful and very expensive screen.
Hidden cases of possible ballots are rolled out from under a table. 4 people under a cloud.
This is the video. This is the video they were spreading. And you can even see here at Donald Trump's own rally, he was spreading this video at the rally.
Overwhelming. And again, I'm going to ask you to look up at that very, very powerful and very expensive screen.
Hidden cases of.
Sorry, one more thing. Did you see it was December? This was December 5th, 2020. So exactly a month before January 6th happened.
Possible ballots are rolled out from under a table.
A very expensive screen.
Hidden cases of possible ballots are rolled out from under a table. 4 people under a cloud of suspicion.
So if you just take the crime of what those Democrat workers were doing, and by the way, there was no water main break. You know, they said there was no water main break. That's 10 times more than I need to win this state. 10 times more. It's 10 times, maybe more than that, but it's 10 times more because we lost by a very close number.
In this committee's hearing last Monday, we heard from senior federal law enforcement officials, from the senior-most federal law enforcement official in Atlanta.
So he knew, remember, he knew what he was doing. He saw the whole video. And also other people have been telling him, you know, since the election in November, other people have been telling him there is no evidence of voter fraud. Other Republicans, like 40 years. His own advisors.
At the time, U.S. Attorney for the Northern District, B.J. Pack, as well as former Attorney General Bill Barr. They both testified that the allegations were thoroughly investigated and found to have no merit. Here is U.S. Attorney Pack.
Particularly to Attorney General Barr, I told him that we looked into it. We've done several things, including interviewing the witnesses. I listened to the tapes and reviewed the videotape myself, and that there's nothing there. Giuliani was wrong in representing that this was a suitcase full of ballots.
And here's what Attorney General Bill Barr had to say about the same allegations.
Took a hard look at this ourselves, and based on our review of it, including the interviews of the key witnesses, the Fulton County allegations had no merit.
We also have testimony from senior Department of Justice officials establishing that they specifically told President Trump that these allegations had been thoroughly.
So there we go. There's the committee telling Donald Trump these allegations have no merit. We investigated them. The ones from Fulton County, the exact county, you know, where that video from the secret suitcases came out from.
Including the interviews of the key witnesses, the Fulton County allegations had no merit.
We also have testimony from senior Department of Justice officials establishing that they specifically told President Trump that these allegations had been thoroughly investigated and were completely without merit. Here's Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue describing a phone conversation in which he specifically told President Trump that these allegations were false.
The president kept fixating on the suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they
carry the ballots. No matter how many times senior Department of Justice officials, including his own Attorney General, told the president that these allegations were not true, President Trump kept promoting these lies and putting pressure on state officials to accept them. On January 2nd, the president had a lengthy telephone conversation with Secretary Raffensperger. Prior to the president's call, though, I want to share a bit of important context. First, the White House, including the former president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, repeatedly called or texted the secretary's office some 18 times in order to set up this call. They were quite persistent. Second, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows took the extraordinary step of showing up at a signature audit site in Georgia, where he met with Secretary Raffensperger's chief investigator, Francis Watson, who was supervising that audit process. Behind me is a photograph from that visit. Third, the day after Meadows' Georgia visit, he set up a call between President Trump and Francis Watson. On the call between President Trump and Georgia investigator Francis Watson, the former president continued to push the false claim that he'd won the state of Georgia. Let's listen to that part of the conversation.
You know, you have the most important job in the country right now, because if we win Georgia, first of all, if we win, you're going to have 2 wins. So they're not going to win right now. You know, they're down because the people of Georgia are so angry at what happened to me. They know I won by hundreds of thousands of votes. It wasn't close.
And in this next clip, he told the state law enforcement official that she'd be
what happened to me. They know I won by hundreds of thousands of votes. It wasn't close.
And in this next clip, he told the state law enforcement official that she'd be praised if she found the right answer.
Fully, I will. When the right answer comes out, you'll be praised. I mean, I don't know why. They made it so hard. They will be praised. People will say, "Great," because that's what it's about. That ability to check and to make it right. Because everyone knows it's wrong. There's just no way.
Mr. Raffensperger, I know you weren't on this call, but that you have listened to it. President Trump didn't win by hundreds of thousands of votes in Georgia, did he?
No, he did not. I've been traveling through the state of Georgia for a year now, and simply put, in a nutshell, what happened in fall of 2020 is that 28,000 Georgians skipped the presidential race, and yet they voted down ballot in other races. And the Republican congressman ended up getting 33,000 more votes than President Trump. And that's why President Trump came up short.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The president on this call doesn't stop here. Let's listen to another part of the conversation between President Trump and Ms. Watson.
Anyway, but whatever you can do, Francis, it would be, it's a great thing. It's an important thing for the country. So important. You have no idea it's so important. Well, and I very much appreciate it.
Whatever you can do, Francis. This is the President of the United States calling an investigator looking into the election in which he is a candidate and asking her to do whatever you can do. Mr. Secretary, he placed this call to your chief investigator on September 23rd, 2020. The Select Committee has received text messages indicating that Mark Meadows wanted to send some of the investigators in her office, in the words of one White House aide, a shitload of POTUS stuff, including coins, actual autographed MAGA hats, etc. White House staff intervened to make sure that didn't happen. It was clear at the time of this call that the former president had his sights set on January 6th. Listen to this portion when he told Francis Watson about a very important date.
Do you think they'll be working after Christmas and keep it going fast? Because, we have that date of the 6th, which is a very important date.
That important date, of course, was the joint session of Congress, where Georgia's electoral votes would be counted for Joe Biden. A little over a week after this call to Francis Watson, the president was finally able to speak with you, Secretary Raffensperger. Bear in mind, as we discuss this call today, that by this point in time, early January, the election in Georgia had already been certified. But perhaps more important, the President of the United States had already been told repeatedly by his own top Justice Department officials that the claims he was about to make to you about massive fraud in Georgia were completely false. Mr. Secretary, the call between you and the President lasted 67 minutes, over an hour. We obviously can't listen to the entire recording here today, although it is available on the Select Committee's website. But we'll listen to selected excerpts of it now so that we can get your insights. Let's begin with the president raising the thoroughly debunked allegations of suitcases of ballots.
In an official voter box, they were in what looked to be suitcases or trunks, suitcases, but they weren't in voter boxes. The minimum number it could be, because we watched it and they watched it certified in slow motion, instant replay, if you can believe it, but had slow motion and it was magnified many times over. And the minimum it was 18,000 ballots, all for Biden.
These are the allegations that the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and your office had all said were false. Is that right?
Correct. And even more importantly, when B.J. Pack resigned as U.S. Attorney of the Northern District, President Trump appointed as acting U.S. Attorney of the Northern District, Bobby Christine. And Bobby Christine looked at that, and he was quoting the AJC, that he found nothing, and he dismissed that case early on.
Oh, wait, now you care about liars? Since when did you care about liars? You know, isn't your beloved Trump, you know, isn't that your guy? He's, you know, this whole thing is about his lies. So I didn't know you cared actually about that.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The president references suitcases or trunks. Mr. Sterling, were the objects seen in these videos suitcases or trunks, or were they just the ordinary containers that are used by election workers?
They're standard ballot carriers that allow for seals to be put on them so they're tamper-proof.
And finally, the president claims that there was a minimum of 18,000 ballots somehow smuggled in, all for Biden. I take it, gentlemen, that was also categorically false?
There's no physical way he can know who those ballots were for, but secondarily,
Okay, well, Shiv is the one asking the question. What do you have about these 3 Republicans who wanted Trump to win in 2020 and their testimonies? Or that they're all liars too, I guess? You know, Donald Trump is the only truthful one here, right?
we had Fulton County for years has been an issue in our state when it comes to elections. So they had a very difficult time during the primary, in large part because of COVID. So we had put them under a consent decree the secretary got negotiated where we had a monitor on site. And his name is Carter Jones. And he took a notation. He had gone from State Farm to the English Street warehouse to look at election day activities. But before he left the State Farm arena, he noted how many ballots had been counted on each one of the machines. And when he came back after we found out they were working again, he took note again when they closed. And I believe the final number was something around 8,900 total ballots were scanned from the time he left to the time about 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the morning. So way below 18,000.
Let's play the next clip.
I heard it was close. I said, there's no way. But they dropped a lot of votes in there late at night. You know that, Brett.
Mr. Secretary, did somebody drop a lot of votes there late at night?
No. I believe that the president was referring to some of the counties when they would upload, but the ballots had all been accepted and had to be accepted by state law by 7 p.m. So there were no additional ballots accepted after 7 p.m.
Let's play the next clip in which the president makes claims about so-called dead voters.
The other thing, dead people. So dead people voted. And I think the number is in close to 5,000 people. And they went to obituaries. They went to all sorts of methods to come up with an accurate number. And a minimum is close to about 5,000 voters.
Mr. Secretary, did your office investigate whether those allegations were accurate? Did 5,000 dead people in Georgia vote?
No, it's not accurate. Actually, in their lawsuits, they allege 10,315 dead people. We found 2 dead people when I wrote my letter to Congress that's dated January 6th. And subsequent to that, we found 2 more. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 people, not 4,000, but just a total of 4, not 10,000, not 5,000.
Let's play the next clip.
And there's nothing wrong with saying that, you know.
Yes, I have watched things that challenge this narrative. If you have a particular video or some kind of evidence that you want to share with me, I'll be happy to watch it. Yes, I have. I have watched documentaries that are pro Trump about January 6th. I've watched people talking their side about who defend Trump and support Trump. I've watched lots of that. That's part of doing proper research. You can't just watch biased content. Do you have actual, like for example, like evidence or a video from like one of these hearings or something that we could watch on stream?
That you've recalculated, because the 2000
documentaries are not the best evidence. They tend to be very biased. So I'd rather watch something from like an actual hearing or just, you know, some kind of video that shows contradicting evidence.
236 and absentee ballots. I mean, they're all exact numbers that were done by accounting firms, law firms, etc. And even if you cut them in half, cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Mr. Secretary, is there any way that you could have lawfully changed the result in the state of Georgia and somehow explained it away as a recalculation?
No, the numbers are the numbers. The numbers don't lie. We had many allegations, and we investigated every single one of them. In fact, I challenged my team, did we miss anything? They said that there was over 66,000 underage voters. We found that there's actually zero. You can register to vote in Georgia. When you're 17 and a half, you have to be 18 by election day. We checked that out, every single voter. They said that there was 2,423 non-registered voters. There were zero. They said that there was 2,056 felons. We identified less than 74 or less that were actually still in felony sentence. Every single allegation we checked. We ran down the rabbit trail to make sure that our numbers were accurate.
So there's no way you could have recalculated it except by fudging the numbers?
The numbers were the numbers, and we could not recalculate because we had made sure that we had checked every single allegation. And we had
Wait, I'm the biased one because I'm going through actual hearings and reading actual court documents and evidence. And because I haven't watched one documentary that you are putting up, that makes me biased. Again, your logic is failing you once again.
many investigations. We had nearly 300 from the 2020 election.
Mr. Secretary, you tried to push back when the president made these unsupported claims, whether they were about suitcases of ballots or that Biden votes were counted 3 times. Let's play the next clip.
The government lies. Okay. The government lies. So does Trump. And if the government is such a liar, then why did Trump get immunity? If the government has all of this, played out and they control all of this and it's all a conspiracy, why did Trump get immunity? Can you answer that? Because that wouldn't make sense, right?
Clip.
President, they did
Genius.
not put that. We did an audit of that and was proved conclusively that they were not scanned 3 times. Yeah, Mr. President, we'll send you the link from WSB that doesn't.
I don't care about
The all of these government hearings, they're liars, but a documentary made by a Trump supporter, that's not a liar. That's just facts. Everything Trump says is a straight fact and truth. That's intelligent.
I don't need it. I have a much better list.
You told the president you would send him a link from WSB, which I understand is a local television station that had a unedited video from the State Farm Arena. But the president wasn't interested in that. He said he had.
President, they did not put that. We can.
I'm sure that we had checked every single allegation. And we had many investigations. We had nearly 300 from the 2020 election.
Mr. Secretary, you tried to push back when the president made these unsupported claims, whether they were about suitcases of ballots or that Biden votes were counted 3 times. Let's play the next clip.
President, they did not put that. We did an audit of that and was proved conclusively that they were not scanned 3 times. Yeah, Mr. President, we'll send you the link from WSB that doesn't.
I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have a much better list.
That's why when police departments get investigated, they have outside investigators. It's usually, there can be internal investigations, but there's usually also an outside party that investigates. It's like a law firm when they're getting investigated. It's usually not an internal investigation because that doesn't make sense. If you're, it doesn't, you're just, the government investigating itself. So wouldn't they, in order to not make themselves look bad, wouldn't they side with Trump then? You just believe in fucking conspiracies and you have nothing to back it up. You just say your only arguments are, oh, well, you can't trust anything.
You told the president you would send him a link from WSB, which I understand is a local television station that had a unedited video from the State Farm Arena. But the president wasn't interested in that. He said he had a much better link. Mr. Secretary, at the time that you were on the call with the president, as we have shown, both the FBI and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation times. Let's play the next clip.
President, they did not put that. We did an audit of that and was proved conclusively that they were not scanned 3 times. Yeah, Mr. President, we'll send you the link from WSB that doesn't.
I don't care about a link. I don't need it. I have Brad, I have a much better link.
He has a much better
You
link.
told the president you would send him a link from WSB, which I understand is a local television station that had a unedited video from the State Farm Arena. But the president wasn't interested in that. He said he had a much better link. Mr. Secretary,
He always
at the
has a
time that
much
you were on the
better
call with the president, as we have shown, both the FBI and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation have proven these claims to be nonsense. And you told him about these investigations on the phone. Let's listen to what President Trump had to say about the state and federal law enforcement officers who investigated these false claims.
There's no way they could find. Then they're incompetent. They're either dishonest or incompetent. Okay, there's only 2 answers: dishonesty or incompetence. There's just no way. Look, there's no way.
But the president didn't stop at insinuating that law enforcement officers were either dishonest or incompetent. He went on to suggest that you could be subject to criminal liability for your role in the matter. Before I play that portion of the conversation, I'd like to show you something that the president retweeted a couple weeks before your call with him. Here's the president retweeting a post from one of his allies, a lawyer who was later sanctioned by a judge in Michigan for making false claims of election fraud. Let's take a look.
Yes, I haven't investigated all perspectives because I haven't watched a documentary that you want me to watch. Gotcha.
At that tweet. The tweet read, quote, President Trump, @real Donald Trump, is a genuinely good man. He does not really like to fire people. I bet he dislikes putting people in jail, especially, quote unquote, Republicans. He gave @Brian Kemp, Georgia, and @Georgia Secretary of State every chance to get it right. They refused. They will soon be.
I told you, if you have evidence or if you have some kind of video that shows evidence contradicting this hearing, then go ahead and show me. But you haven't said anything. You just told me to watch this fucking documentary.
Going to jail. So on your call, this was not the first time the president was suggesting you might be criminally liable. With that, let's listen to this portion of the call.
I think you're going to find that they are shredding ballots because they have to get rid of the ballots because the ballots are unsigned. The ballots are corrupt. And they're brand new and they don't have seals. And there's a whole thing with the ballots, but the ballots are corrupt. And you're going to find that they are, which is totally illegal. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk.
Secretary Raffensperger, after making a false claim about shredding of ballots, the president suggested that you may be committing a crime by not going along with his claims of election fraud. And after suggesting that you might have criminal exposure, President Trump makes his most explicit ask of the call. Let's play a part of that conversation.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Mr. Secretary, was the president here asking you for exactly what he wanted? One more vote than his opponent.
What I knew is that we didn't have any votes to find. We had continued to look. We investigated, like I just shared the numbers with you. There were no votes to find. That was an accurate count that had been certified. And as our general counsel said, there was no shredding of ballots.
Mr. Secretary, after making this request, the president then goes back to the danger of having you deny these allegations of fraud. Let's listen to that part of the clip.
And I watched you this morning and you said, well, there was no criminality, but I mean, all of this stuff is very dangerous stuff. When you talk about no criminality, I think it's very dangerous for you to say that.
Secretary Raffensperger, you wrote about this in your book, and you said, quote, I felt then and still believe today that this was a threat. Others obviously thought so too, because some of Trump's more radical followers have responded as if it was their duty to carry out this threat. Please tell us what you, your wife, even your daughter-in-law experienced regarding threats from Trump's more radical followers.
Well, after the election, my email, my cell phone was doxxed, and so I was getting text all over the country, and then eventually my wife started getting the text, and hers typically came in as sexualized texts, which were disgusting. You have to understand that Trish and I, we met in high school, and we've been married over 40 years now, and so they started going after her, I think, just to probably put pressure on me. Why don't you just quit, walk away? And so that happened. And then some people broke into my daughter-in-law's home, and my son has passed, and she's a widow, and has 2 kids, and so we're very concerned about her safety also.
They broke into her home. They broke into this man's daughter, his deceased son's wife's home. Trump supporters.
And Mr. Secretary, why didn't you just quit and walk away?
Because I knew that we had followed the law and we had followed the Constitution. And I think sometimes moments require you to stand up and just take the shots. You're doing your job. And that's all we did. You know, we just followed the law and we followed the Constitution. And at the end of the day, President Trump came up short. But I had to be faithful to the Constitution. And that's what I swore an oath to do.
During the remainder of the call, the former president continued to press you to find the remaining votes that would ensure his victory in Georgia. Let's listen to a little more.
Why wouldn't you want to find the right answer, Brad, instead of keep saying that the numbers are right? So look, can you get together tomorrow? And Brad, we just want the truth.
Why wouldn't you want to just say the right answer instead of keep saying that the numbers are right?
It's simple. And everyone's going to look very good if the truth comes out. It's okay. It takes a little while, but let the truth come out. And the real truth is I won by 400,000 votes, at least. So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
4 days after the president's call to Secretary Raffensperger was January 6th.
These are fellow Republicans that wanted Trump to win that election in 2020.
The president whipped up the crowd in front of the ellipse, once again promoting the allegation that Secretary Raffensperger, the president's own attorney general, had told him was false. Here he is on the ellipse.
In Fulton County, Republican poll watchers were ejected, in some cases physically, from the room under the false pretense of a pipe burst. Water main burst, everybody leave, which we now know was a total lie. Then election officials pulled boxes, Democrats, and suitcases of ballots out from under a table. You all saw it on television. Totally fraudulent and illegal.
You all saw it on television because he was spreading it, this lie that he knew, he was aware of was a lie, and he was intentionally spreading this to brainwash the public, like you people, like some of you people, sorry, maybe not all of you, some of you people watching this and in the chat still believe that this election was fucking stolen because of Donald Trump intentionally putting that in your head for this reason. So, good job. And you'll deny all the evidence against it because you just want it so bad to be true because Donald Trump told you that. Daddy Donald Trump.
Legally scanned them for nearly 2 hours, totally unsupervised. Tens of thousands of votes. This act coincided with a mysterious vote dump of up to 100,000 votes for Joe Biden, almost none for Trump. Oh, that sounds fair. That was at 1:34 a.m.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Sterling, I want to thank you for your service to the state of Georgia and to the country. Speaker Bowers, likewise, I want to thank you for your service to the state of Arizona and to the country. You have served not only your home states, but our nation and our democracy. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. I thank the witnesses for joining us today. You're now dismissed.
Yeah, I sure I am. I'm sure.
This afternoon. Andrea Shea Moss. Ms. Moss worked in the Department of Registration and Elections in Fulton County, Georgia, from 2017 until 2022. In that job, Ms. Moss handled voter applications and absentee ballot requests and also helped to process the vote count for several elections. In December 2020, Ms. Moss and her mother, Ms. Ruby Freeman, became the target of nasty lies spread by President Trump and his allies as they sought to overturn the election results in Georgia. Ms. Moss and her mother, Ms. Freeman, are two of the unsung heroes in this country, doing the hard work of keeping our democracy functioning for every American. Ms. Moss, welcome. Thank you for your service, and I thank you for being here today. I will now swear you in. Please stand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. Ms. Moss, thank you very much for being here today. I understand that you are here along with your mother today. Would you like to introduce your mama? Hi, Mom. Ms. Moss, today we'll be asking you about some of the threats that you received following the 2020 election. Since you've been an election worker for over 10 years, I want to ask you, in your decade of service, had you ever experienced threats like these before? Don't be nervous. Just, I understand. So, and I want to make sure that the record reflects that you've done it for quite a while.
Just make
and
shit
you
up
never
in your head.
received the
That's
threats.
okay.
And your answer was no.
You have to tell yourself what you have to make
Thank
you
you.
feel better.
Pursuant to Section 5C8 of the House Resolution 503, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for questions.
Good afternoon, Ms. Moss. Thank you for being here. I understand that you were employed by the Fulton County Registration and Elections Department for more than 10 years, and I understand that you love that job. Please tell us what made you so fond of the work that you did.
Well, I've always been told by my grandmother how important it is to vote and how people before me, a lot of people, older people in my family, did not have that right. So what I loved most about my job were the older voters. Younger people could usually do everything from their phone or go online, but the older voters like to call, they like to talk to you, they like to get my card, they like to know that every election I'm here. And like even college students, a lot of parents trust in me to make sure their child does not have to drive home. They'll get an absentee ballot, they can vote, and I really found pleasure in that. I liked being the one that, if someone can't navigate my voter page or, they want a new precinct card and they don't have a copy machine or a computer or all of that, I could put it in the mail for them. I was excited always about sending out all the absentee ballots for the elderly, disabled people. I even remember driving to an hospital to give someone her absentee application. That's what I love the most.
So you really enjoyed helping people vote and participate, and that was something, the right to vote, that your grandmother taught you was precious.
Yes.
Well, I know the events that we're here to talk about today are incredibly difficult to relive. Your proud service as an election worker took a dramatic turn on the day that Rudy Giuliani publicized a video of you and your mother counting ballots on election night. President Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and others claimed on the basis of this video that you and your mother were somehow involved in a plot to kick out observers, bring suitcases of false ballots for Biden into the arena, and then run them through the machines multiple times. None of that was true, was it?
None of it.
I'd like to show you some of the statements that Rudy Giuliani made in a second hearing before the Georgia state legislators, a week after that video clip from State Farm Arena was first circulated by Mr. Giuliani and President Trump. I want to advise viewers that these statements are completely false and also deeply disturbing.
Tape earlier in the day of Ruby Freeman and Shay Freeman Moss and one other gentleman, quite obviously, surreptitiously passing around USB ports as if they're vials of heroin or cocaine. I mean, it's obvious to anyone who's a criminal investigator or prosecutor, they are engaged in surreptitious illegal activity again that day. And after a week ago, and they're still walking around Georgia lying. They should have been questioned already. Their places of work, their homes should have been searched for evidence of ballots, for evidence of USB ports, for evidence of voter fraud.
That video was from Rudy Giuliani's appearance at a Georgia State Senate hearing on December 10. How did you first become aware that Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, was accusing you and your mother of a crime?
I was at work, like always, and the former chief, Mr. Jones, asked me to come to his office, and When I went to his office, the former director, Mr. Barron, was in there, and they showed me a video on their computer. It was just like a very short clip of us working at State Farm, and it had someone on the video like talking over the video, just saying that we were doing things that we weren't supposed to do, just lying.
Wait, so he's accusing her of actually passing around drugs, or was that hyperbole? Is he accusing her of passing around USBs with what, with ballots or something?
Throughout the video, and that's when I first found out about it.
And were there social media posts that they showed you responding to those false claims?
Well, when I saw the video, of course, the first thing that I said was like, why? Why are they doing this? What's going on? And they, just told me that Trump and his allies were not satisfied with the outcome of the election, and they were getting a lot of threats and being harassed online, and asked me, have I been receiving anything, and I need to check on my mom. And I told them, I was like, where have they, where have you been getting these threats? I don't believe I have any. And Mr. Jones told me like they're attacking his Facebook, and I don't really use Facebook. I have one, so I went to the Facebook app, and I'm just kind of panicky at this point because this has never happened to me, and my mom is involved. And I'm like her only child. So I'm just asking him, like, well, where are the messages? All I see is the feeds. Like, how do you get to the messages? And he said, it's another icon on your phone that says Messenger. And I went to that icon, and it was just a lot of horrible things there.
And those horrible things, did they include threats?
Yes, a lot of threats, wishing death upon me, telling me that, I'll be in jail with my mother, and saying things like, be glad it's 2020 and not 1920. That's, yeah.
Were a lot of these threats and vile comments racist in nature?
A lot of them were racist. A lot of them were just hateful. But yes, sir.
In one of the videos we just watched, Mr. Giuliani accused you and your mother of passing some sort of USB drive to each other.
I'm sure.
What was your mom actually handing you on that video?
A ginger mint.
It wasn't just Rudy Giuliani. We heard President Trump make these false allegations repeatedly during his call with Secretary Raffensperger. Let's listen to a portion of what he had to say about you and your mother.
We had at least 18,000, that's on tape. We had them counted very painstakingly, 18,000 voters having to do with Ruby Freeman. She's a vote scammer, a professional vote scammer and hustler.
Professional vote scammer.
Donald Trump attacked you and your mother using her name 18 times on that call. 18 times. Ms. Moss, can you describe what you experienced listening to former President Trump attack you and your mother in a call with the Georgia Secretary of State?
I felt horrible. I felt like it was all my fault. Like, if I would have never decided to be an elections worker, like, I could have done anything else, but that's what I decided to do. And now people are lying and spreading rumors and lies and attacking my mom. I'm her only child. Going to my grandmother's house. I'm her only grandchild. And my kid. It's just, I felt so bad. I just felt bad for my mom, and I felt horrible for picking this job and being the one that always wants to help and always there, and never missing not one election. I just felt like it was my fault for putting my family in this situation.
Well, it wasn't your fault. Your mother was kind enough to come speak with us earlier. Let's listen to her story in her words.
My name is Ruby Freeman. I've always believed that when God says that he'll make your name great, but this is not the way it was supposed to be. I could have never imagined the events that followed the presidential election 2020. For my entire professional life, I was Lady Ruby. My community in Georgia, where I was born and lived my whole life, knew me as Lady Ruby. I built my own business around that name, La Ruby's Unique Treasures. a pop-up shop catering to ladies with unique fashions. I wore a shirt that proudly proclaimed that I was, and I am, Lady Ruby. Actually, I had that shirt on. I had that shirt in every color. I wore that shirt on Election Day 2020. I haven't worn it since, and I'll never wear it again. Now I won't even introduce myself by my name anymore. I get nervous when I bump into someone I know in the grocery store who says my name. I'm worried about who's listening. I get nervous when I have to give my
I wonder if I
name
can
for
find
food
that video.
orders. I'm always concerned of who's around me. I've lost my name and I've lost my reputation. I've lost my sense of security, all because a group of people starting with number 45 and his ally, Rudy Giuliani, decided to scapegoat me and my daughter, Shay, to push their own lies about how the presidential election was stolen.
Ms. Moss, how has this experience of being targeted by the former president and his allies affected your life?
He's turned my life upside down. I no longer give out my business card. I don't transfer calls. I don't want anyone knowing my name. I don't want to go anywhere with my mom because she might yell my name out over the grocery aisle or something. I don't go to the grocery store at all. I haven't been anywhere at all. I've gained about 60 pounds. I just don't do nothing anymore. I don't want to go anywhere. I second guess everything that I do. It's affecting my life in a major way, in every way. All because of lies. For me doing my job, same thing I've been doing forever.
Your mother also told the select committee about how she had to leave her own home for her safety and go into hiding after the FBI told her that it would not be safe for her there before January 6th and until the inauguration. Let's listen to a clip of her story in her own words.
Around the week of January 6th, the FBI informed me that I needed to leave my home for safety. And I left my home for safety around that time.
Understood. How long did you stay out? Did you remain outside of your home for your own safety?
I stayed away from my home for approximately 2 months. It was horrible. I felt homeless. I felt, I can't believe this person has caused this much damage to me and my family. To have to leave my home, that I've lived there for 21 years. And, I'm having to have my neighbors watch out for me, and I have to go and stay with somebody. It was hard. It was horrible.
And that your conversation with the FBI about needing to leave your home for your own safety, or perhaps recommending it, do you remember, was there a specific threat that prompted that, or was it the accumulation of threats that you had received?
What prompted it was getting ready to.
I can't find the video.
January 6th was about to come, and they did not want me to be at home because of all the threats and everything that I'd gotten. They didn't want me to be there in fear of, the people would come into my home, and I had a lot of that, so they didn't want me to be there. Just in case something happened. I asked, how long am I going to have to be at home? They said at least until the inauguration.
I don't know. I can't find the video of her
Ms. Moss, I understand that people once showed up at your grandmother's house. Tell us about that experience.
I received a call from my grandmother. This woman is my everything. I've never even heard her or seen her cry ever in my life. And
okay.
She called me screaming at the top of her lungs, like, Shay, oh my God, Shay, just freaking me out, saying that there were people at her home and they, they knocked on the door, and of course she opened it and seeing who was there, who it was, and they just started pushing their way through, claiming that they were coming in to make a citizen's arrest. They needed to find me and my mom. They knew we were there. And she was just screaming and didn't know what to do. And I wasn't there, so, I just felt so helpless and so horrible for her. And she was just screaming. I told her to close the door. Don't open the door for anyone. And, you know, she's a 70-something, I won't say, year-old woman, and she doesn't like having restrictions. She wants to answer the door. She likes to get her steps in, walking around the neighborhood. And
All right, her
Help
grandmother was
Fulton
like
County running the
attacked.
election in the middle of the pandemic.
Thank you, Ms. Moss. Thank you, Ms. Freeman, or as America now knows her, Lady Ruby, for your service to Fulton County, Georgia, our country. When he used the power of his presidency to put the enormous pressure on state, local, and local elections officials and his own vice president, it became downright dangerous. On January 6th, that pressure became deadly. Ruby Freeman said the president is supposed to protect every American, not target.
All right, let's watch another one. All right, let's try this.
Heard this from President Trump's former acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donahue. We heard from members of
This one talks more about Mike Pence. Mike Pence's part in all this.
President Trump's White House staff as well. Today, we're focusing on President Trump's relentless effort to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th. Here again is how the former vice president phrased it in a speech before the Federalist Society, a group of conservative lawyers.
This week, that President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. But President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president.
Sure.
What the president wanted the vice president to do was not just wrong, it was illegal and unconstitutional. We will hear many details in today's hearing, but please consider these 2 points. First, President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do. This is testimony from Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who served in the Trump administration in multiple positions over 4 years.
But just to pick up on that, Mr. Short, was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
Okay.
But President Trump plotted with a lawyer named John Eastman to pressure Pence to do so anyway. As the federal court has explained, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. What exactly did President Trump know? When exactly did President Trump know that it would be illegal for Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes? Here is one sample of testimony given by one of the witnesses before us today, the Vice President's General Counsel.
Did John Eastman ever admit, or, in front of the president, that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count
I believe he did on the 4th.
That was January 4th, 2 days before the attack on Congress. A second point, please listen to testimony today about all of the ways that President Trump attempted to pressure Vice President Pence, including Donald Trump's tweet at 2:24 p.m. condemning Vice President Mike Pence when President Trump already knew a violent riot was underway at the Capitol. In future hearings, you will hear from witnesses who were present inside the White House, who were present inside the West Wing on that day. But today we focus on the earnest efforts of Mike Pence, who was determined to abide by his oath of office. As Vice President Pence prepared a statement on January 5th and 6th, explaining that he could not illegally refuse to count electoral votes, he said this to his staff.
All of them.
I mean, the Vice President said, this may be the most important thing I ever say. This meaning the statement? The statement. And he really wanted to make sure that it was just so.
You will hear today that President Trump's White House counsel believed that the Vice President did exactly the right thing on January 6th, as did others in the White House, as did Fox News host Sean Hannity. Vice President Pence understood that his oath of office was more important than his loyalty to Donald Trump. He did his
also
duty.
go over that
President Trump
Trump immunity
unequivocally
video.
did not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we intend to show the American people that January 6th was not an isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception.
Yes, exactly.
We've already
This is what
learned
a lot
that
of
President
people
Trump
don't
knew
consider.
he lost the 2020 election. Shortly after, he began to look for a way to circumvent our country's most fundamental civic
January
tradition,
6th was
the peaceful transfer.
Was the boiling point. It's like what all the scheming was leading up to January 6th. It wasn't January 6th isn't just January 6th. It was events that had taken over a whole at least month, over a month, up to a month like and a half, maybe 6 weeks leading up to January 6th. And January 6th was the end point, but this was a scheme that led up to January 6th, because that was the day that the votes were being certified. The vote count was being certified. So
Power. The president latched on to a dangerous theory and would not let go because he was convinced it would keep him in office. We witnessed firsthand what happened when the president of the United States weaponized this theory. The Capitol was overrun, police officers lost their lives, and the vice president was taken to a secure location because his safety was in jeopardy. Let's take a look at the effect of Donald Trump's words and actions. I want to warn our audience that the video contains explicit content.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing the Pence. I hear the Pence just caved.
No.
Is that true?
I didn't
I'm hearing reports that Pence caved.
No
I'm
way.
telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets. You fucking politicians are gonna get fucking drugged through the streets. Yeah.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
did you hear how he worded that? Mike Pence is gonna do the right thing according to Trump. They don't even know. They probably don't even know what they want Mike Pence to do. It's just, Donald Trump said it, so that means it must be true. Mike Pence must do the right thing. That is an indication
How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol and threatened to hang President Trump's own vice president? You'll hear from witnesses that Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence to adopt a legally and morally bankrupt idea that the vice president could choose who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump.
I was talking about this, I think it was last night, how Mike Pence, a couple years back, he was considered an extreme conservative. I don't want to say radical, but he was considered a pretty extreme conservative. And now Mike Pence is one of the good guys. He's one of the, a pretty normal conservative just because of how far the right has gone. And the left has gotten extreme too. They're extremists on the left as well, of course. But I think it's the norm for today in today's politics for the right to have very extreme views.
That the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen. You'll hear how Vice President Pence withstood an onslaught of pressure from President Trump, both public.
We need to reel everybody in on both sides, right? And we need to reel everybody in a little bit. Calm. Let's just calm. Everyone needs to just fucking calm down. Because the more tension between the two sides, the further and further we drive each other away.
publicly and privately, a pressure campaign that built to a fever pitch with a heated phone call on January 6th. You'll also hear that the president knew there was a violent mob at the Capitol when he tweeted at 2:24 p.m. that the vice president did not have the, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed true to his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. We're honored to have two distinguished witnesses who advised Vice President regarding his role on January 6th. Judge J. Michael Ludick is one of the leading conservative legal thinkers in the country. He served in the administrations of President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was appointed by the latter to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where he served from 1991 to 2006. He provided critical advice for Vice President Pence regarding the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress shortly before that fateful moment. He's written that the Vice President does not have the power to select the next President of the United States. He's also written that that contrary theory espoused by one of his own former law clerks was, quote, incorrect at every turn. We're also joined today by one of the people who was with Vice President Pence on January 6th. Greg Jacob was counsel to Vice President Pence. He conducted a thorough analysis of the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But he also has firsthand information about the attack on the Capitol because he lived through it. He was with the Vice President and his own life was in danger. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. In the United States, the people choose our representatives, including the highest official in the land, the President of the United States. The American people did this on November 3rd, 2020. But President Trump did not like the outcome. He did everything he could to change the result of the election. He tried litigation, 62 cases, in fact, and that failed. He tried to pressure state legislatures to reverse the results of the election in their states, but they refused. He tried to enlist the Department of Justice in his efforts to overturn election results, but officials leading the department refused to comply. So eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one man, his own vice president, could determine the outcome of the election. He wanted the vice president to unilaterally select the president. This theory that the vice president could unilaterally select the president runs completely contrary to our Constitution, our laws, and the entirety of our American experience. But that didn't matter to President Trump. I would now like to explore.
Do you guys imagine if Biden was accused of doing this shit? You guys would lose your fucking minds. I would lose my mind too. Because anybody who does this is fucking crazy, but I couldn't even fucking imagine. The hypocrisy is just so real.
How President Trump came to latch on to this ridiculous legal theory that the vice president can select the president of the United States. Mr. Jacob, how did this theory first come to your attention?
The first time that I had a conversation with the vice president about the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act was in early December, around December 7th. The vice president called me over to his West Wing office and told me that he had been seeing and reading things that suggested that he had a significant role to play on January 6th in announcing the outcome of the election. He told me that he had been first elected to Congress in 2000 and that one of his earliest memories as a congressman was sitting in on the 2001 certification, and he recalled that Al Gore had gavelled down a number of objections that had been raised to Florida. And he asked me mechanically, how does this work at the joint session? What are the rules? And I told the Vice President that, in fact, I had a fairly good idea of how things work, that actually there aren't rules that govern the joint session, but what there is a provision of the Constitution that's just one sentence long, and then an Electoral Count Act that had been passed in 1887. And I told the Vice President that I could put a memo together for him overnight that would explain the applicable rules.
So, Mr. Jacobs, when you looked at this theory, what did you conclude?
So we concluded that what you have is a sentence in the Constitution that is inartfully drafted. But the Vice President's first instinct when he heard this theory was that there was no way that our framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome because they were on the ticket for the election, in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome of the election. And our review of text, history, and frankly just common sense all confirm the Vice President's first instinct on that point. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the Vice President has that kind of authority.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. We will hear more today about how, despite this conclusion by you and other top legal advisors, the former president used this discredited theory in his campaign to pressure the Vice President to decide the outcome of the presidential election. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge Ludig, thank you as well for being here with us today. You issued a very important statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. And I'd like to ask you, Judge, about one of the sentences in your statement and ask if you could explain to us the significance of it. You say, had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis. Could you elaborate on that for us, Judge?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. That passage in my statement this morning referenced the most foundational concept in America, which is the rule of law. Thus, as I interpret your question, you were asking about that foundational truth of these United States, which we call America.
Oh, this guy talks so fucking slow. This is on 1.75 speed.
The foundational
This is
truth
slower than
is the rule of law.
anyone else we've listened to
That
on regular
foundational
speed.
truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. But it's not merely the profound truth for the United States. It's also the simple truth, the simple foundational truth of the American Republic. Thus, in my view, the hearings being conducted by this select committee are examining that profound truth, namely the rule of law in the United States of America. The specific question, of course, before you and before the nation, not before me, is whether that foundational rule of law was supremely violated on January 6th, 2021. Now, to the question specifically that you asked, Madam Vice Chair, I believe that had Vice President Pence obeyed the orders from his president and the President of the United States of America during the joint session of the Congress of the United States on January 6, 2021, and declared Donald Trump the next President of the United States, notwithstanding that then President Trump had lost the Electoral College vote as well as the popular vote in the 2020 presidential election.
Oh my God, does this guy speak one word at a time?
That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis in America, which in my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic.
Thank you very much, Judge, for your solemn attention to these issues and for your appearance here today. We're going to describe and discuss in detail what happened. And as we do, I'm going to describe a few of the details now of some of the actions taken by a gentleman named Kenneth Chesebro after the Electoral College met and passed their votes on December 14th. Actually, the day before they met, Kenneth Chesebro sent a memo to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead outside counsel. Mr. Chesebro wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the vice president is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. Chesebro wrote that when the joint session of Congress got to Arizona in the alphabetical list of states, the vice president should not count the Biden votes, quote, because there are two slates of votes. His justification, which we will learn more about in our next hearing, was that a group of Trump supporters in Arizona and other swing states decided to proclaim themselves the true electors for the state, creating two sets of electors, the official electors selected by the state and a group of fake electors. This document was ordered to be produced to the Select Committee by a federal district court judge. As you will see on the screen shortly, Judge David Carter wrote, quote, the draft memo pushed a strategy that knowingly violated the Electoral Count Act. The judge concluded that, quote, the memo is both intimately related to and clearly advanced the plan to obstruct the joint session of Congress.
And this is what, in the last video that we just watched, from another hearing date, except I don't think it was in the part that we just watched. It was in the part that I covered last night. They were talking about people were testifying and they were showing videos of Trump and his people, like Rudy Giuliani and others, calling people to try to get them to come up with these fake set of electors. And I'm pretty sure it was fucking Ted Cruz who said it was his, not only, you know, an option, but it should be his duty to send in those fake electors, this new slate of electors, if he believes that the election was actually, that there was actual voter fraud. It was actually his duty to do that. Even though, once again, all the voter fraud claims had been investigated, and Trump's own advisors and other Republicans and his own attorney general were all telling him there's no evidence of voter fraud. But they ignored it, and they wanted these fake these secondary slate of electors, fraudulent elector slates to be, their votes to be counted instead. But Trump was calling his allies from many different states, targeted states specifically, like Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, to try to get them to participate in this scheme, and none of them complied. I'm pretty sure none of them complied. If so, I haven't heard which ones have. But so far, all the testimonies we've heard have been people saying that they didn't comply. Because, yeah. Including Mike Pence.
On January 6, 2021. A few days later, Professor John Eastman took up this cause. Eastman was at the time a law professor at Chapman University Law School. He prepared a memo outlining the nonsensical theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election at the joint session of Congress on January 6th. You will see portions of this memo on the screen. In the first line, he wrote, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate. But Dr. Eastman goes on to rely on those so-called dual slates of electors to say that Vice President Pence could simply declare President Trump the winner of the 2020 election. Mr. Jacob, were there in fact dual slates of electors from 7 states?
No, there were not.
And just a few days after that, Dr. Eastman wrote another memo. This one, quote, wargaming out several scenarios. He knew the outcome he wanted, and he saw a way to go forward if he simply pretended that fake electors were real. You will see that memo up on the screen now. Here, Dr. Eastman says the vice president can reject the Biden electors from the states that he calls, quote, disputed. Under several of the scenarios, the vice president could ultimately just declare Donald Trump the winner, regardless of the vote totals that had already been certified by the states. However, this was false, and Dr. Eastman knew it was false. In other words, it was a lie. In fact, on December 19, 2020, just 4 days before Dr. Eastman sent this memo, Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead on arrival in Congress, end quote, because they did not have a certification from their states. Judge Ludig, did the Trump electors in those 7 states who were not certified by any state authority have any legal significance?
Congresswoman, there was no support whatsoever in either the Constitution of the United States nor the laws of the United States for the vice president, frankly, ever to count alternative electoral slates from the states that had not been officially certified by the designated state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in the passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said in that passage that there was both legal authority as well as historical precedent. I do know what Mr. Eastman was referring to when he said that there was historical precedent for doing so. He was incorrect. There was no historical precedent from the beginning of the founding in 1789 that even as mere historical precedent, as distinguished from legal precedent, would support the possibility of the Vice President of the United States, quote, counting alternative electoral slates that had not been officially certified to the Congress pursuant to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I would be glad to explain that historical precedent if the committee wanted, but it would be a digression.
Thank you very much, Judge. I know my colleagues will be pursuing that issue in more depth. And now I'd like to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, and staff counsel, Mr. John Wood, for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're fortunate to have a bipartisan staff. Senior Investigative Counsel John Wood previously served as United States Attorney in Missouri under President George W. Bush. He and I will share today's lines of questioning. Mr. Wood?
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Judge Ludig, I had the incredible honor of serving as one of your law clerks. Another person who did was John Eastman. And you have written that Dr. Eastman's theory that the Vice President could determine who the next President of the United States is, in your words, incorrect at every turn. Could you please explain briefly your analysis?
Briefly, let's see how this goes.
It was my honor, Mr. Wood, to have you serve as my law clerk. I could answer that question perfectly if I had at my disposal either Mr. Eastman's tweet or my own
He literally speaks one
analytical
fucking word
tweet of
at a
September
time.
21st, but I don't. But that said, let me try to remember the analysis of Mr. Eastman's analysis.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very insightful analysis. When you wrote, I believe that Professor Eastman was incorrect at every turn of the analysis in his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors presented from 7 states. You've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion that the Vice President could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were allegedly presented. So what was your basis for concluding that Dr. Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the Vice President could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from these disputed states?
I understand. As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman Cheney, there was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all. None. With all respect to my co-panelist, he said, I believe in partial response to one of the Select Committee's questions, that the single sentence in the 12th Amendment was, he thought, inartfully written. That single sentence is not inartfully written. It was crystal clear that the President of the Senate on January 6th, the incumbent Vice President of the United States, had little substantive constitutional authority, if any, at all. The 12th Amendment, the single sentence that Mr. Jacob refers to, says in substance that following the transmission of the certificates to the Congress of the United States and under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the Archivist of the United States, that the presiding officer shall open the certificates in the presence of the Congress of the United States in joint session. It then says, unmistakably, not even that the Vice President himself shall count the electoral votes. It clearly says merely that the electoral count votes shall then be counted. It was the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that filled in, if you will,
This guy is a judge. Imagine
the
him reading
simple
out
words
your
of
sentences.
the 12th Amendment
Just like
in order to
one word at a time.
construct
This is
for the
on
country
2 times speed.
a process for the counting of the sacred process for the counting of the electoral votes from the states.
You will be sentenced to the sentence I am going to sentence you to regarding the crimes that you have committed. It's like, Jesus fucking Christ, just spit it out.
That neither our original Constitution nor even the 12th Amendment had done. The irony, if you will, is that from its founding until 1887, when Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, the nation had been in considerable turmoil during at least 5 of its presidential elections, beginning as soon thereafter from the founding as 1800. So it wasn't for almost 100 years later until the Electoral Count Act was passed. So that's why, in my view, that piece of legislation is not only a work in progress for the country, but at this moment in history, an important work in progress that needs to take place. That was long-winded, I understand.
Well, Judge Ludick, at the risk of oversimplifying for the non-lawyers who are watching, is it fair to say that the 12th Amendment basically says 2 things happen? The Vice President opens the certificates and the electoral votes are counted. Is it that straightforward?
I would not want that to be my testimony before the Congress of the United States. The language of the 12th Amendment is that simple.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Jacob, I have a question for you. I believe during your deposition before this committee, you said something to the effect of you'd read every word written about the 12th Amendment, the Electoral Count Act, and historical practice. I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
So, you, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Ludig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question, and the purpose of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 had been to resolve those latent ambiguities. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the Vice President does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the Vice President could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised to various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count Act. So we started with that text. And I recall in my discussion with the Vice President, he said, I can't wait to go to heaven and meet the framers and tell them the work that you did in putting together our Constitution is a work of genius. Thank you. It was divinely inspired. There is one sentence that I would like to talk to you a little bit about. So then we went to structure. And again, the Vice President's first instinct here is so decisive on this question. There's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III and declared him to be a tyrant, there was no way that they would have put in the hands of one person the authority to determine who was going to be President of the United States. And then we went to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876, Justice Bradley of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote on that commission, had specifically looked at that question and said, first, the Vice President clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything. And by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out for a public look at things. So the history was absolutely decisive. And again, part of my discussion with Mr. Eastman was, if you were right.
So, like, what are people fucking disputing here? I don't understand. You guys just not think that Trump tried to do these things? That there are literally phone calls of him pressuring people to tell them to try to do? What is the argument? You just don't want to believe it. You just can't believe it. That's the only conclusion I can come to.
Right. Don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself president of the United States? Did you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious quirk that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point in time. But so text, structure, history, I think what we had was some ambiguous text that common sense and structure would tell you the answer cannot possibly be that the vice president has that authority. As the committee already played the vice president's remarks, there's almost no idea
I
more.
wonder if this is what they're talking about here is what ended up being the amendment to the ECA, the Electoral Count Act, immediately after the 2020 election. So one of like Biden's first things he did was there was an amendment to the Electoral Count Act. I wonder if the amendment has to do with this line of text that they're referring to here that was quite ambiguous. Because I read about it, and that's kind of how it was worded. It was that the text in the Constitution about the ECA was pretty ambiguous and vague and outdated. So they made an amendment to it. Biden made an amendment to it in 2021, immediately after this January 6th debacle. Is that the word? Debacle? Scheme happened.
Un-American than the notion that any one person would choose the American president. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the vice president did not have such an authority.
Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. Jacob, you weren't the only one who knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Here's what various advisors to the president thought about that theory.
Fiasco, debacle, yeah.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the vice president having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I have.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly agree with you or say, yeah, that makes sense, or okay?
I believe that that Mark did agree.
What makes you say that?
I believe that's what he told me. But as I mentioned, I think Mark had told so many people so many different things that it was not something that that I would necessarily accept as, okay, well, that means that's resolved.
I see. Tell me more what he told you on this topic.
Well, I think it was that, the vice president doesn't have any broader role. And I think he was understanding that.
So despite the fact that he may have said other things to the president or others, to you, he said he understands the vice president has no role.
Yes.
Okay. Did he say that to you several times?
A couple times.
Mm-hmm. Before January 6th?
Yes.
The way it was communicated to me was that Pastor Baloney thought the idea was nutty and had at one point confronted Eastman basically with the same sentiment.
Pat expressed his admiration for the vice president's actions on the day of the 6th and said that he concurred with the legal analysis that our team had put together to reach that point.
It made no sense to me that in all the protections that were built into the Constitution for a president to get elected and steps that have to be taken, that the power to choose the next president would be sitting with the vice president.
Do you know if Mr. Clark or Mr. Morgan, viewed about that, thought about that, Mr. Eastman's advice?
Yeah, they thought he was crazy.
Do you know if they ever expressed an opinion on whether they thought the vice president had the power that John Eastman said he did?
I know for a fact I've heard both say that his theory was crazy, that there was no validity to it in any way, shape, or form.
And did they express that before January 6th?
Yes.
To whom?
I think anyone who would listen.
Okay. What were your prior interactions with Eastman?
He described for me what he thought the ambiguity was in the statute, and he was walking through it at that time. And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And he said, yes. And I said, are you out of your effing mind? Right? And that was pretty blunt. I said, you're completely crazy. I said, you're going to turn around and tell 78 plus million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen. And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets. And he said, words to the effect of, there's been violence in the history of our country to protect the democracy or protect the republic.
In fact, there was a risk that the lawyers in the White House counsel's office would resign. For example, Fox News host Sean Hannity expressed concern that the entire White House counsel's office could quit. As you can see from these texts, Mr. Hannity wrote to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that, quote, we can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January 6th happening the way he is being told. A few days later, on January 5th, Mr. Hannity wrote to Mr. Meadows that, quote, I'm very worried the next 48 hours. Hence pressure, White House counsel will leave. While Sean Hannity was apparently very concerned about the possibility that the White House counsel would resign in protest of the president's effort to force the vice president to violate the Constitution, some others, close to the president, were more dismissive of the White House counsel's position. Here's what Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner said during his deposition regarding the White House counsel Pat Cipolloni's threats to resign.
Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign?
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
The president's own lead outside counsel, Rudy Giuliani, also seemed to concede that the vice president did not have the authority to decide the outcome of the election or send it back to the states. Here's what White House Attorney Eric Hirschman said about his call with Mayor Giuliani on the morning of the 6th.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue, right? And I was like getting dressed, and we had an intellectual discussion about Eastman's. I don't know if it's Eastman's theory per se, but the VP's role. And he was asking me my view and analysis and then the practical implications of it. And when we finished, he said, "I believe that you're probably right." I think he thought we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench, but he'd probably come down in that you couldn't interpret it or sustain the argument long term.
Of course, the fact that Mayor Giuliani seemed to admit that the theory was wrong did not stop him from going before the crowd just a few hours later on January 6th and saying the exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
We're here just very briefly to make a very important 2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal. I have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that. He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United States. It is perfectly appropriate, given the questionable constitutionality of the Election Counting Act of 1887, that the vice president can cast it aside, and he can do what a president called Jefferson did when he was vice president. He can decide on the validity of these crooked ballots, or he can send it back to the legislatures, give them 5 to 10 days to finally finish the work.
And here's what Dr. Eastman said in his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
What are you gonna fucking say about that? This is him admitting to trying to do this. This is all a giant scheme. At some point in the speech too, I believe he also says trial by combat. So let's not forget that rhetoric either.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
This is after they've been told again and again and again, advised by their own people, their own AG, other Republicans from these accused incidents of election fraud, voter fraud, that there is no supporting evidence for it. And these are from people that wanted Trump to win.
Even Dr. Eastman knew his theory didn't hold water. Mr. Jacob, you discussed and even debated this theory at length with Dr. Eastman. Did Dr. Eastman ever tell you what he thought the U.S. Supreme Court would do if it had to decide this issue?
Yes. We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. And when I pressed him on the point, I said, John, if the vice president did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started, well, I think maybe we would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right, we would lose 9-0.
I appreciate that. In our investigation, the Select Committee has obtained evidence suggesting that Dr. Eastman never really believed his own theory. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the president from October 2020. In this letter, an idea was proposed that the vice president could determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, the 12th Amendment only says that the president of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted. The comments in blue further state, nowhere does it suggest that the president of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own. Judge Ludig, does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Yes, it does, Congressman. But watching this unfold, let me try to unpack what was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this, and I foreshadowed this answer in my earlier to overturn the 2020 election. What was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this. And I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the president that there was both legal as well as historical precedent for the vice president to overturn the election. And what we've heard today, I believe, is what happened within the White House and elsewhere as all the players, led by Mr. Eastman, got wrapped around the axle by the historical evidence claim by Mr. Eastman. Let me explain very simply. This is what I said would require a digression that I would be glad to undertake if you wished. In short, if I had been advising the Vice President of the United States on January 6th, and even if then Vice President Jefferson and even then Vice President John Adams and even then Vice President Richard Nixon had done exactly what the President of the United States wanted his Vice President to do, I would have laid my body across the road before I would have let the Vice President overturn the 2020 election on the basis of that historical precedent. But what this body needs to know, and now America needs to know, is that that was the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the 2020 election. It was the historical precedent in the years and with the vice presidents that I named, as Congressman Raskin understands well. And the effort by Mr. Eastman and others was to drive that historical precedent up to and under that single sentence, single pristine sentence in the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution, taking advantage of, if you will, what many have said is the inartful wording of that sentence in the 12th Amendment. Scholars before 2020 would have used that historical precedent to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election by accepting non-certified state electoral votes, but they would have made arguments as to some substantive, not merely procedural, authority possessed by the Vice President of the United States on the statutorily prescribed day for counting the electoral college votes. This is constitutional mischief.
Judge, I think that's a good point. And I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened? Why hasn't a vice president simply rejected the outcome of an election and declared someone else the winner? And instead, as the chairman mentioned in his opening, for over 2 centuries, vice presidents have presided over the joint sessions of Congress in a purely ceremonial role. This even includes, as Mr. Jacob mentioned, Vice President Al Gore. For those of us who are old enough to remember, the 2000 election came down to one state, Florida. There were weeks of recounts and litigation after the election, and Al Gore conceded. Of course, Al Gore was vice president at the time. But he never suggested that he could simply declare himself the winner of the 2000 election when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes. Let's hear what Vice President Gore said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy, it's a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
So this was one of the many points that we discussed on January 5th. He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election. And I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it.
Right. So that's very interesting. So this upcoming election, Kamala Harris is vice president. And she's also running for president in the current election, similar to 2021 when Al Gore was vice president running for president. So if this whole, elector fucking scheme that Trump and his people tried to come up with and tried to put through as some type of legit plan to make Trump president, is true, then therefore Kamala, this election could just do just that and make herself president because she's vice president. She's in the same position that Mike Pence is in. Mike Pence, do the right thing. Imagine if we were saying that about Kamala. Kamala, you're vice president, so I guess that means the election is totally up to your hands. You can certify the electors you know that you choose. That's absolutely ridiculous, and anybody defending this is frankly retarded.
In 2000, Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today. Mark Short told the Select Committee that Vice President Pence consulted with one of his predecessors, Vice
Honestly,
President
that
Quayle,
might be
regarding the role of the
too
Vice President. Vice President Quayle confirmed Pence's view that the
of
role
a
was purely
term
ceremonial. Mr.
for
Short
them.
also told the committee that he, Mr. Short, received a call from former House Speaker Paul Ryan. Here's Mr. Short's description of his conversation with Speaker Ryan.
Speaker Ryan wanted to call and say, you don't have any greater authority. And I said to him, Mr. Speaker, Mike, he doesn't. He recognizes that. And we sort of laughed about it, and he said, I get it. And he later spoke to the Vice President to, I think, have the same conversation.
Fortunately, for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demands that he determine the outcome of the presidential election. Mr. Jacob, what was the Vice President's reaction when you discussed with him the theory that the Vice President could decide the outcome of the election? Congressman, as I testified, the Vice President's first instinct was that there was no way that any one person, particularly the Vice President who is on the ticket and has a vested outcome in the election, could possibly have the authority to decide it by rejecting electors or to decisively alter the outcome by suspending the joint session for the first time in history in order to try to get a different outcome from state legislatures. Despite the fact that the Vice President has strongly held and correct view that he could not decide the outcome of the election, President Trump launched a multi-week campaign of both public and private pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence to violate the Constitution. Here are some examples of the intense pressure the Vice President faced from all sides and what his Chief of Staff thought of
My
it.
mom's boyfriend left.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And he'd been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
I'm aware of the fact that the president was upset with the way Pence acted. Are we to assume that this is going to be a climactic battle?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved.
That'd be a nice way to say a guy named Mike.
Fortunately, for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demands that he determine the outcome of the presidential election. Strongly held and correct view that he could not suspending the joint session for the first time in history in order to try to get a different outcome from state legislatures. Despite the fact that the Vice President had a strongly held and correct view that he could not decide the outcome of the election, President Trump launched a multi-week campaign of both public and private pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence to violate the Constitution. Here are some examples of the intense pressure the Vice President faced from all sides and what his Chief of Staff thought of it.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And he'd been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
I am aware of the fact that the president was upset with the way Pence acted. Are we to assume that this is going to be a climactic battle?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved.
That'd be a nice way to say a guy named Vice President Mike Pence?
Yes.
I think we've been clear as to what the Vice President's role was. I think the Vice President been clear with the President. I think I've been clear with Mark Meadows.
I think the Vice President is going to throw down tomorrow and do the right thing because, Lou, like I said before, this is a time for choosing. People are going to look back at this moment tomorrow and remember where every single one of their elected officials were. Did they vote for the rule of law and getting these elections right, or did they give it away to the Democrats and the people who cheated and stole their way through this election?
Definitely.
I just want to take a second to really just pause here and just soak it in how wild that fucking is. We had newscasters trying to push for this scheme to go through based off of this intentionally pushed lie that Trump knew was a lie. He was made aware of was a lie again by his own people, his own advisors, his own team. He didn't care. People to this day, again, still fucking believe this. And people were pushing for Mike Pence to do the right thing. Are they going to push Kamala to do the right thing this election? The election fraud had been investigated. Again, his own people was telling him it was not legit. There was no merit to any of these allegations. And again, these were other Republicans, other Trump supporters some of his own advisors telling him this. That is pure corruption, and the fact that we have him running again as a candidate is insane, especially now that he fully understands the Supreme Court's ruling of his immunity. That should be very concerning. Should be concerning for, the fact that that applies to any president. But now that Trump is, tried this, was given immunity, and he's made aware of the judgment, and he's running again. If he wins, that should be very concerning. And, I'm not, like, trying to be dramatic. I'm not a politics person. Like, I wouldn't cover this if I didn't think it was actually a big fucking deal. So, yeah.
When I got back into town, as Fox said, like the 5th and the 6th, the president was, all the attention was on what Mike would do or what Mike wouldn't do.
The vice president really was not wavering in his commitment to what his responsibility was. And so, yeah, was it painful? Sure.
The president's pressure campaign started in December. For example, although the vice president made his views clearly and unmistakably known to the president and others in the White House, on December 23rd, President Trump retweeted a memo from an individual named Ivan Reichland entitled Operation Pence Card that called on the vice president to refuse the Electoral College votes from certain states that had certified Joe Biden as the winner. President Trump started his pressure campaign in December, but he dialed up the pressure as January 6th approached. The pressure is January.
America, Vice President Mike Pence must do this tomorrow to defend our Constitution from our enemies, foreign, China, Russia, Iran, and domestic big tech censorship, mainstream news media censorship, corrupt officials at the federal, state, and local levels. Let him know.
January 6th approached. The testimony we have received in our investigation indicates that by the time January 4th arrived, President Trump had already engaged in a, quote, multi-week campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the election. This had included private
Literally, okay, to put it plainly, what that guy just said, to pressure Mike Pence to decide the outcome of the election. Put it plainly, that is exactly what Mike Pence should do the right thing means, was to single-handedly determine the outcome of the election. And again, if this rule applies, that the vice president has that power to certify, which specific slate of electors he wants, or in this case, she, then therefore, Kamala Harris, the vice president, right now, I guess, has the single hand in determining who wins this election. Oh, and guess what? She's on the ticket. So, according to this logic, she can just single-handedly declare herself as president. If we want her to do the right thing, which is what they were trying to get Mike Pence to do, which is just obviously absurd. And there are phone calls of Trump trying to pressure people to get along with this. And nobody cares. It's crazy. This video has 500 views. Oh, okay, this one has 147,000, but still.
Conversations between the two leaders, Trump's tweets, and at least one meeting with members of Congress. We understand that the vice president started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the vice president returned to Washington, he was summoned to meet with the president regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress. Mr. Jacob, who attended that meeting?
The attendees were the vice president, the president, Mark Short, the chief of staff to the vice president, myself, and John Eastman. There was about a 5-minute period where Mark Meadows came in on a different issue.
Let's show a photo of that meeting. Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the president and the vice president, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were 2 legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his capacity as presiding officer to suspend the proceedings and declare essentially a 10-day recess for arguments.
Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the president and the vice president, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
It's a cool picture.
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his capacity as presiding officer to suspend the proceedings and declare essentially a 10-day recess.
Can Kamala do that this
during
election?
which,
Do you guys
states
want
that he deems to be
to do what she
disputed. There was a
does?
list of 5 to 7 states that the exact number changed from conversation to conversation, but that the vice president could sort of issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to re-examine the election and declare who had won each of those states. So he said that both of those were legally viable options. He said that he did not recommend, upon questioning, he did not recommend what he called the more aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable, that the imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president, so rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew and had studied about our Constitution that one person would have that kind of authority.
And did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not delay certification and send it back to the states?
No, he did not.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
So during that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions, but he thought that we could do so because in his view the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional. And when I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that path.
Mr. Wood?
But just to reiterate, he told you, maybe this was in a later conversation, but he told you at some point that if, in fact, the issue ever got to the Supreme Court, his theory would lose 9-0, correct?
The next morning, starting around 11 or 11:30, we met for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And in that meeting, I've already described the text, structure, history conversation, but we started walking through all of that. And I said, so John, basically what you have is some text that may be a little bit ambiguous, but then nothing else that would support it, including the fact that nobody would ever want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? And again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose 7-2, but ultimately acknowledged that no, we would lose 9-0. No judge would support his argument.
After his meeting with the vice president, Donald Trump flew to Georgia for a rally in support of the Republican candidates in the United States Senate runoff. Even though the vice president had been steadfast in resisting the president's pressure, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump turned his attention to Mike Pence. Here's what the president said during that rally in Georgia.
Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
So the president had been told multiple times that the vice president could not affect the outcome of the election, but he nonetheless publicly pressured Mike Pence to do exactly that by saying, quote, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him as much. Let's turn now to January 5th. Mr. Wood?
Thank you. That morning, meaning January 5th, the president issued a tweet expressly stating that the vice president had the power to reject electors. Let's look at what the president wrote. Quote, the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. Mr. Jacob, you've already told us about your meeting with Dr. Eastman and the president on January 4th, and you briefly made reference to the meeting you had with Dr. Eastman the next day, January 5th. Can you tell us a little bit more about that meeting with Dr. Eastman on January 5th? For example, where was the meeting? Who was there?
So at the conclusion of the meeting on the 4th, the president had asked that, that our office meet with Mr. Eastman the next day to hear more about the positions he had expressed at that meeting, and the vice president indicated that sort of offered me up as his counsel to fulfill that duty. So we met in Mark Short's office in the executive office building across the way from the White House. Dr. Eastman had a court hearing by Zoom that morning, so it didn't start first thing, but rather started around 11. And that meeting went for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Chief of Staff Mark Short was at that meeting most of the time. There were a few times that he left. And essentially, it was an extended discussion. What most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors." So on the 4th,
I'm so sorry. I have to rewind. I was ordering a salad. Okay. I'm so sorry. Bad host. Bad host.
provisions, but he thought that we could do so because in his view, the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional. And when I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort. January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise as a recess, during which
make a recess,
won each of those states.
Or just
so
reject
he
the
said that both of those were legally viable. Aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president, so rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew and had studied about our Constitution that one person would have that kind of authority.
And did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not delay certification and send it back to the states?
No, he did not.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
So during that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions. But he thought that we could do so because in his view, the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional. And when I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that path.
Mr. Wood?
But just to reiterate, he told you, maybe this was in a later conversation, but he told you at some point that if, in fact, the issue ever got to the Supreme Court, his theory would lose 9-0, correct?
The next morning, starting around 11 or 11:30, we met for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And in that meeting, I've already described the text, structure, history conversation, but we started walking through all of that. And I said, John, basically what you have is some text that may be a little bit ambiguous, but then nothing else that would support it, including the fact that nobody would ever want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? And again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose 7-2, but ultimately acknowledged that no, we would lose 9-0. No judge would support his argument.
After his meeting with the vice president, Donald Trump flew to Georgia for a rally in support of the Republican candidates.
The fact that we even have fucking government officials taking like an hour to debate that is like almost just as concerning. Like, the fuck? I almost like the fucking like evil side in me wants Trump to become president just to see like what actually will happen. But again, like it's maybe it's not even an evil side, it's just like a curious side. I'm just like I don't know. But no, I don't want that at all, obviously. I'm just so curious.
In the United States Senate runoff. Even though the vice president had been steadfast in resisting the president's pressure, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump turned his attention to Mike Pence. Here's what the president said during that rally in Georgia.
Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
So the president had been told multiple times that the vice president could not affect the outcome of the election, but he nonetheless publicly pressured Mike Pence to do exactly that by saying, quote, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him as much. Let's turn now to January 5th. Mr. Wood?
Thank you. That morning, meaning January 5th, the president issued a tweet expressly stating that the vice president had the power to reject electors. Let's look at what the president wrote.
Kitty.
Quote, the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. Mr. Jacob, you've already told us about your meeting with Dr. Eastman and the president on January 4th, and you briefly made reference to the meeting you had with Dr. Eastman the next day, January 5th. Can you tell us a little bit more about that meeting with Dr. Eastman on January 5th? For example, where was the meeting? Who was there?
So at the conclusion of the meeting on the 4th, the president had asked that, that our office meet with Mr. Eastman the next day to hear more about the positions he had expressed at that meeting, and the vice president indicated that sort of offered me up as his counsel to fulfill that duty. So we met in Mark Short's office in the executive office building across the way from the White House. Dr. Eastman had a court hearing by Zoom that morning, so it didn't start first thing, but rather started around 11. And that meeting went for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Chief of Staff Mark Short was at that meeting most of the time. There were a few times that he left. And essentially, it was an extended discussion. What most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors." So on the 4th, that had been the path that he had said, "I'm not recommending that you do that." But on the 5th, he came in and expressly requested that. And I grabbed a notebook as I was heading into the meeting. I didn't hear much new from him to record, but that was the first thing I recorded in my notes was request that the VP reject.
Just to be clear, you're saying that Dr. Eastman urged the vice president to adopt the very same approach that Dr. Eastman appeared to abandon in the Oval Office meeting with the president the day before. Is that correct?
He had recommended against it the evening before, and then on the 5th came in, and I think it was probably his first words after introductions and as we sat down were, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors in the disputed states."
And you referenced a moment ago some handwritten notes, which you've provided to the Select Committee. I'd now like to show you those notes. As you can see, you wrote there at the top, the writing's a little bit faint in the copy, but you wrote, "Requesting VP reject." Does that accurately reflect what Dr. Eastman asked of you in your meeting on January 5th?
Yes.
And what was your reaction when Dr. Eastman said on January 5th that he was there to ask the Vice President of the United States to reject electors at the joint session of Congress?
I was surprised because I had viewed it as sort of one of the key concessions that we had secured the night before from Mr. Eastman that, that he was not recommending that we do that.
So what did you say to him?
Well, as I indicated, to some extent it simplified my task because there are more procedural complexities to the send it back to the states point of view, and I actually had spent most of my evening the night before writing a memorandum to the Vice President explaining all of the specific provisions of the Electoral Count Act that that plan would violate. So instead, since he was pushing the sort of robust unilateral power theory, I've already walked the committee through the discussions that we had. I started out with our points of commonality. We're conservatives, we're small government people, we believe in originalism as the means by which we're going to interpret this. And so we walked through the text, we walked through the history, and the committee had shown footage of Mr. Eastman on the stage on the 6th claiming that Jefferson supported his position in a historical example of Jefferson. In fact, he conceded in that meeting Jefferson did not at all support his position, that in the election of 1800, there had been some small technical defect with the certificate in Georgia. It was absolutely undisputed that Jefferson had won Georgia. Jefferson did not assert that he had any authority to reject electors. He did not assert that he had any authority to resolve any issue during the course of that. And so he acknowledged by the end that there was no historical practice whatsoever that supported his position. He had initially tried to push examples of Jefferson and Adams. He ultimately acknowledged they did not work. As we've covered, he acknowledged it would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court. He again tried to say, but I don't think the courts will get involved in this. They'll invoke the political question doctrine. And so if the courts stay out of it, that will mean that we'll have the 10 days for the states to weigh in and resolve it. And then they'll send back the Trump slates of electors and the people will be able to accept that. And I expressed my vociferous disagreement with that point. I did not think that this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the Vice President as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive some signed letters that Mr. Eastman forwarded us by minorities of leaders in those states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would have had just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in. So I said, I think the courts will intervene. I do not see a commitment in the Constitution of the question whether the vice president has that authority to some other actor to resolve. There's arguments about whether Congress and the vice president jointly have a constitutional commitment to generally decide electoral vote issues. I don't think that they have any authority to object or reject them. I don't see it in the 12th Amendment, but nonetheless. And I concluded by saying, John, in light of everything that we've discussed, can't we just both agree that this is a terrible idea? And he couldn't quite bring himself to say yes to that, but he very clearly said, well, yeah, I see we're not going to be able to persuade you to do this. And that was how the meeting concluded.
But you just described a terrifying scenario. Sounds like there could have been chaos under the Eastman approach, and you even described it as it potentially could be decided in the streets. And you described several concessions that Dr. Eastman made throughout that discussion or even debate that you had with him. At some point during that meeting on January 5th, Dr. Eastman seemed to admit that both of the theories that he had presented to the United States the day before. So the theory that the vice president could reject electors outright and declare Donald Trump the winner, and his less aggressive theory that the vice president could simply send it back to the states. At some point in that conversation on the 5th, did Dr. Eastman seem to admit that both of these theories suffered from similar legal flaws?
So I had at least one, possibly two other conversations with Dr. Eastman later that day. In the earlier meeting, we really were focused, because his request that he made had been reject the electors outright, on why that theory was wrong and why we certainly would not be doing that. Later that day, he pivoted back to, well, we hear you loud and clear, you're not going to reject. But remember last night, I said that there was this more prudent course where you could just send it back to the states. Would you be willing to do that? And during the course of our discussion about his renewed request that we consider that option, he acknowledged to me, he put it, both Mr. Eastman and myself are graduates of the University of Chicago Law School. And he said, look, as graduates of that august institution, you and I will mutually understand that the underlying legal theory of plenary vice presidential authority is what you have to get there. Because this new theory, as I was pointing out to him, or the procedural theory, still violates several provisions of the Electoral Count Act, as he acknowledged. And the only way that you could ever be able to ignore several provisions of statutory law is if it was pretty clear that they were unconstitutional. And the only way they could be unconstitutional is if the vice president had the plenary authorities that were formed the basis for the reject the votes as well. So he acknowledged in those conversations that the underlying legal theory was the same. He just thought that the send it back to the states option would be more politically palatable, and he hoped more palatable to the vice president for that reason.
And in fact, when Dr. Eastman made this concession during that meeting, according to your earlier deposition, Dr. Eastman said, just between us, University of Chicago chickens. Is that right?
I don't think that the University of Chicago is going to start a Chicago Chickens fundraising club. But yes, that is the terminology that he used. He said, just between us Chicago chickens, we will understand as lawyers who have studied the Constitution that the underlying basis really is the same.
I reserve the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Mr. Jacob, the president and the vice president meet again on that same topic the next day, January 5th, correct?
So after my extended meeting with Mr. Eastman that morning, during that time, the vice president had been back at his residence working on his statement to the nation that we released the next day. He got down to the White House some point between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock as my meeting with Mr. Eastman was wrapping up. And when Mark Short and I went over to meet with the vice president, and actually we thought maybe we had good news. We felt like we had sort of defeated Mr. Eastman. He was sort of acknowledging that there was no there. But the vice president was then asked down to the Oval Office. And he went down to the Oval Office while Mark and I stayed back in the vice president's office.
You weren't in that meeting?
I was not.
In the book Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, if these people say you have the power, wouldn't you want to? The vice president says, quote, I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority. The president responds, but wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power? The vice president is reported to have said, no, look, I've read this, and I don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no. To which the president says, no. You don't understand, Mike. You can do this. I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this. We asked Mark Short about this during his deposition.
I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do that.
An understanding that I would have in other conversations with the vice president, he articulated to me that no, he wouldn't want that power bestowed upon any one person.
Mr. Jacob, did you, Mr. Short, and the vice president have a call later that day again with the president and Dr. Eastman?
So yes, we did.
And what did Dr. Eastman request on that call?
On that phone call, which I believe was around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Mr. Eastman stated that he had heard us loud and clear that morning. We were not going to be rejecting electors, but would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral votes.
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election. Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it.
This is what I'm saying.
Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president.
This was all out in the open. This was all public. This was all being talked about. The fucking news was pushing Mike Pence to do this. How fucking blind. It's actually baffling.
Certification of the electoral votes.
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election.
I guess what they say is hiding in plain sight, right? That's exactly what Trump did here with this scheme.
Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it. Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president had agreed that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Let's look at what the president said in his statement. Quote, "The New York Times report regarding comments Vice President Pence supposedly made to me today is fake news." He never said that. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. Mr. Jacob, how did the vice president's team react to the statement from the president that the vice president could take an active role in determining the winner of the presidential election?
We were shocked and disappointed because whoever had written and put that statement out, it was categorically untrue.
The Vice President's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, had an angry phone call with Trump campaign senior advisor Jason Miller about this statement. Here's what Mr. Short and Mr. Miller told the committee about that call.
Okay, tell me about the conversation you had with Jason.
It was brief. I was irritated and expressed displeasure that a statement could have gone out that misrepresented the vice president's viewpoint without consultation.
The statement says the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. Is that incorrect?
I think the record shows that that's incorrect.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been through many documents that clarify that this is not where the vice president was.
Right. So essentially, the president is sending out a baldly false statement about being in alignment, purported alignment with the vice president, despite all of the predicate that you indicated had gone before about their respective positions. Is that effectively what happened?
I interpret this statement as false. I'll let you figure out who sent it out.
When Mark Short contacted you, he was upset. Is that what you said?
He clearly was not pleased.
Tell us what he said.
What's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting where only two people were in the room?
Did he ask you to retract the statement?
No, I think it went right to what's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting when only two people were in the room.
And he clearly disagreed with the substance, though, right? Because he said the vice president doesn't agree with this.
I'm trying to think what exactly he said. I mean, the tone was very clearly that he used some language to strongly infer that the vice president disagreed with that take. I don't remember what that language was.
Did he dictate the statement?
He dictated most of it. I mean, typically on these, I might have a couple of wording suggestions, or maybe I, have a sentence or a rough framework or something of that. But I know with specificity on this one that it was me and him on the phone talking through it, and ultimately the way this came out was the way that he wanted to.
The dispute between the president and the vice president had grown to the point where the vice president's chief of staff, Mark Short, was concerned that the president could, in Mr. Short's words, quote, lash out at the vice president on January 6th. In fact, Mr. Short was so concerned about it that he talked with the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail on January 5th. Here's Mr. Short.
Concern was for the vice president's security, and so I wanted to make sure the head of the vice president's Secret Service was aware that that likely.
So funny because Trump's entire campaign basically runs on it's fake news. It's fake news and the mainstream media narrative and the misinformation. It's total hypocrisy. I think it's done intentionally.
As these disagreements became more public, that the president would lash out
There's
somewhat.
evidence for this fake news.
After the recess, we will hear that Mark Short's concerns were justified. The vice president was in danger. Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Pursuant to the order of the committee of today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Okay, here's a recess.
In the middle of the night, on January 5th, into the morning of the he did not have and would not want the power to decide, which told the president that he did not have in our nation's history. To turn to the events of
Recognized.
Okay, here we go. Here we go.
I'd now like to turn to the events of January 6th, 2021, which turned out to be a fateful day in our nation's history. Despite the fact that the vice president consistently told the president that he did not have and would not want the power to decide the outcome of the presidential election, Donald Trump continued to pressure the vice president, both publicly and privately. As you will hear, things reached a boiling point on January 6th, and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle of the night, on January 5th, into the morning of the 6th, around 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted at the vice president, meaning that the comments in response to the president's tweet would also show up on the vice president's Twitter feed.
Okay.
The tweet stated that the vice president could, quote, come through for us and send it back to the states. Then around 8 a.m. on January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, we win, and that this is the time for extreme courage.
It's crazy. That is fucking crazy.
The tweet stated that the vice president could.
If Donald Trump tweeted this 1 a.m. January 6, 2021. If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back.
Quote, come through for us and send it back to the states.
Again, this is after he's been told by his own advisors, his own people, his own supporters, other Republicans that supported him, that wanted him to win. After they investigated these claims of I was about to say insurance fraud, election fraud, voter fraud, that there was no merit to them. He knew this. He put out that fake video that he knew wasn't secret suitcases full of magic ballots. He was aware of all of this, and he put this in people's heads.
Yeah, it wasn't defense. We lost the attack. It was just, dude, it's 7 of us versus 12.
Stop the steal. What he was doing,
Bro, we had 20.
what that slogan should really say, is start the steal. Go through with the steal. Do the steal. That's what they were really trying to do. It's so fucking ironic.
Then around 8 a.m.
I mean, he's putting it in plain text right here. It was on news stations. As trying to really say that Mike Pence had this power to single-handedly declare Donald Trump as president based on these fraudulent numbers that had no credibility behind them.
On January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, we win, and that this is the time for extreme courage. That the vice president said at a meeting on Mr. Short told us during his deposition that the vice president started a meeting on January 6th in prayer. Here's what Mr. Short said.
You arrived at the vice president's residence.
As would often be the case, I recall that knowing it would be an important day, we gathered in prayer. And often that would be something the staff member would lead. So it would have just been at that time, I believe, the vice president, myself, Greg, and Chris. And we would have just asked for guidance and wisdom, knowing that the day was going to be a challenging one.
Mr. Jacob, did you go to the vice president's residences on the morning of January 6th?
Yes.
Who else was with you?
Mark Short, Devin O'Malley, our communications director, and Chris Hodgson, our legislative affairs director.
And did the vice president have a call with the president that morning?
He did.
Were you with the vice president during the call?
So we had been putting the vice president had finalized his statement overnight. We were in the process of proofing it so that we could get that out. And we were told that a call had come in from the president. The vice president stepped out of the room to take that call, and no staff went with him.
The president had several family members with him in the Oval that morning for that call. I'd like to show you what they and others told the Select Committee about that call, along with never-before-seen photographs of the president on that call from the National Archives.
When I got in, somebody called me and said that the family and others were in the Oval, and do I want to come up? So I went upstairs.
And who do you recall being in the Oval Office?
Don Jr., Eric, Laura, Kimberly, I believe Meadows was there. At some point, Ivanka came in.
It wasn't a specific formal discussion. It was very sort of loose and casual.
So then you said at some point there's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president. Is that correct?
Yes.
When I entered the office the second time, he was on a telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president's end?
Only heard the president's end. But at some point, it started off as a calmer tone and everything, and then became heated.
The conversation was pretty heated.
I think till it became somewhat, louder tone. I don't think anyone was paying attention to it initially.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what'd you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, you don't have the courage to make a hard decision.
I don't remember exactly, it was something like that, yeah. You're not tough enough to make the call.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Did Ms. Trump share with you any more details about what had happened, or any details about what had happened in the Oval Office that morning?
That her dad had just had an upsetting conversation with the vice president.
Do you recall anything about her demeanor, either during the meeting or when you encountered her in Dan Scavino's office?
I don't remember specifically. I mean, I think she was uncomfortable over the fact that there was obviously that type of interaction between the two of them.
Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
And the word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president, I apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word.
Mr. Jacob, how would you describe the demeanor of the vice president following that call with the president?
When he came back into the room, I'd say that he was steely, determined, grim.
Of course, the most dangerous part of what Donald Trump did on January 6th was what he did himself. As will be discussed in detail in a future hearing, our investigation found that early drafts of the January 6th ellipse speech prepared for the president included no mention of the vice president. But the president revised it to include criticism of the vice president and then further ad-libbed. Here is what the president said on January 6th after his call with Vice President Pence.
I'm still
I
listening.
hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people. And I just spoke to Mike. I said, Mike, that doesn't take courage. What takes courage is to do nothing. That takes courage. And then we're stuck with a president who lost the election by a lot, and we have to live with that for 4 more years. We're just not going to let that happen. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
Of course, we all know what happened next. The president's words had an effect. President Trump's supporters became angry. When the vice president issued his public letter, the crowd at the Capitol erupted in anger. The rioters who had erected makeshift gallows began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Testimony in our investigation has made clear what the target of the rioters' ire was: Vice President Mike Pence.
Oh, sorry, that was unmuted.
The rioters breached the Capitol at 2:13 p.m. Now let's take a look at what was going on at the White House at this time. We received testimony that the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, was notified of the violence at the Capitol by 2 p.m., and likely earlier. The testimony further establishes that Mr. Meadows quickly informed the president, and that he did so before the president issued his 2:24 p.m. tweet criticizing Vice President Pence for not having, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Here's what the president wrote in his 2:24 p.m. tweet while the violence at the Capitol was going on. And here's what the rioters thought.
nothing but a traitor, and he deserves to burn with the rest of them.
So this all escalated after Pence. What happened to Pence? Pence didn't do what we wanted.
Pence voted against Trump.
Okay, and that's when all this started?
Yep, that's when we marched on the Capitol. We've been shot at with rubber bullets, tear gas.
We just heard that Mike Pence is not going to reject any fraudulent elector vote. That's right. You heard it here first. Mike Pence has betrayed the United States of America.
And we know that because we just saw the evidence.
Mike Pence has betrayed this president, and he has betrayed the people of the United States, and we will never, ever forget.
It's real simple. Pence betrayed us, which apparently everybody knew he was going to, and the president mentioned it like 5 times when he talked. You can go back and watch the president's video.
This is our capital. Let's be respectful to him. There's 4 million people coming in, so there's a lot of control. We love you guys. We love the cops.
It's only a matter of time. Justice is coming.
Betrayed them. Just
Although the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, has refused to testify before this committee, Mr. Meadows' aide, Ben Williamson, and White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews testified that Mr. Meadows went to the dining room near the Oval Office to tell the president about the violence at the Capitol before the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet. In future hearings, you'll hear more about exactly what was happening in the White House at that time. But here is what some White House staff told the Select Committee.
Do you know where he went?
Yes, I followed him down the hallway, and I followed him into the outer Oval corridor, which is the hallway between the Oval Office hallway and the outer Oval section of the Oval Office. I followed him into that little corridor hallway. I saw him walk into outer Oval. I maybe took a step into outer Oval and then left. And I don't know where he went outside of that, but it looked like he was headed in the direction of the Oval Office.
We had all talked about at that point about how it was bad and the situation was getting out of hand. And I know Ben Williamson and I were conferring, and we thought that the president needed to tweet something immediately. And I think when Kaylee gave us that order of don't say anything to the media, I told her that I thought the president needed to tweet something. And then I remember getting a notification on my phone, and I was sitting in a room with Roma and Ben, and we all got a notification. So we knew it was a tweet from the president, and we looked down, and it was a tweet about Mike Pence.
I believe I had sent him a text saying that we may want to put out some sort of statement because the situation was getting a little hairy over at the Capitol. And then it was common for, after I would text him, I would just go down and see him in person.
You went down to speak with Mark Meadows after this. What was that conversation?
Very brief. I went down and told him the same thing I have in the text that I can recall. And I don't remember anything that was said between us other than I told him that. And to my recollection, he immediately got up and left his office.
Our investigation found that immediately after the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet, the crowds both outside the Capitol and inside the Capitol surged. The crowds inside the Capitol were able to overwhelm the law enforcement presence, and the vice president was quickly evacuated from his ceremonial Senate office to a secure location within the Capitol complex. By 2:24 p.m., the Secret Service had moved Vice President Pence from the Senate chamber to his office across the hall.
The noise from the rioters became audible, at which point we recognized that maybe they had gotten into the building.
Then, President Trump tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth."
It was clear that it was escalating quickly. So then when that tweet, the Mike Pence tweet, was sent out, I remember us saying that that was the last thing that needed to be tweeted at that moment. The situation was already bad, and so it felt like he was pouring gasoline on the fire by tweeting that.
30 seconds later, rioters already inside the Capitol opened the East Rotunda door, just down the hall. And just 30 seconds after that, rioters breached the crypt, 1 floor below the vice president.
The Secret Service couldn't control the situation and do their job of keeping him safe.
At 2:26 p.m., Secret Service rushed Vice President Pence down the stairs.
I think they've been trying to figure out whether they had a clear route to get us to wherever it was that they wanted to move us to.
We moved pretty quickly down the stairs and through various hallways and tunnels to the secure location. Upon arriving there was further discussion as to whether or not we were going to leave the Capitol complex or stay where we were.
Vice President Pence and his team ultimately were led to a secure location, where they stayed for the next 4.5 hours, barely missing rioters a few feet away. Approximately 40 feet. That's all there was. 40 feet between the vice president and the mob. Mr. Jacob, you were there, seeing that for the first time. Does it surprise you to see how close the mob was to the evacuation route that you took? The 40 feet is the distance from me to you, roughly.
I could hear the din of the rioters in the building while we moved, but I don't think I was aware that they were as close as that.
Make no mistake about the fact that the vice president's life was in danger. A recent court filing by the Department of Justice explains that a confidential informant from the Proud Boys told the FBI that the Proud Boys would have killed Mike Pence if given a chance. This witness, whom the FBI affidavit refers to as W1, stated that other members of the group talked about things they did that day, and they said that anyone they got their hands on, they would have killed, including Nancy Pelosi. W1 further stated that members of the Proud Boys said that they would have killed Mike Pence if given a chance. We understand that congressional leaders and others were evacuated from the Capitol complex during the attack. We'd like to show you what happened after the vice president was evacuated from the Senate.
The Select Committee has obtained never-before-seen photos from the National Archives that show Vice President Pence sheltering in a secure underground location as rioters overwhelmed the Capitol. At 4:19 p.m., Vice President Pence is seen looking at a tweet the president had just sent, a tweet asking the rioters to leave the Capitol. After 4.5 hours spent on working to restore order, the vice president returned to the Senate floor to continue the certification of electors.
Crazy.
So Vice President Pence was a focus of the violent attack. Mr. Jacob, did the vice president leave the Capitol complex during the attack?
He did not.
Can you please explain why the vice president refused to leave the Capitol complex?
When we got down to the secure location, Secret Service directed us to get into the cars, which I did. And then I noticed that the vice president had not. So I got out of the car that I had gotten into, and I understood that the vice president had refused to get into the car. The head of his Secret Service detail, Tim, had said, "I assure you, we're not going to drive out of the building without your permission." And the vice president had said something to the effect of, "Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel." And the vice president did not want to take any chance that the world would see the vice president of the United States fleeing the United States Capitol. He was determined that we would complete the work that we had set out to do that day, that it was his constitutional duty to see through, and that the rioters who had breached the Capitol would not have the satisfaction of disrupting the proceedings beyond the day on which they were supposed to be
I'm saying
completed.
it's so crazy. I never thought I'd be like clapping for Mike Pence. Like a couple years ago, he was considered a very like extreme conservative, and now he's like one of the good guys.
Let me see if I understand this right. You were told to get in the cars, and how many of the vice president's staff got in the cars while he did not?
Most of us.
During our investigation, we received testimony that while the vice president was in a secure location within the Capitol complex, he continued the business of government. We understand that the vice president reached out to congressional leaders, like the acting secretary of defense and others, to check on their safety and to address the growing crisis. In addition, the vice president's chief of staff, Mark Short, made several calls to senior government officials. Here's Mr. Short's testimony regarding his call with Representative Kevin McCarthy.
He indicated that he'd had some conversation. I don't recall whether it was with the president or somebody at the White House, but I think he expressed frustration that not taking the circumstances seriously as they should in that moment.
So Mr. McCarthy indicated he'd been in touch with someone at the White House, and he conveyed to you that they weren't taking this as seriously as they should. You have to answer yes or no.
Yes.
Okay.
While the vice president made several calls to check on the safety of others, it was his own life that was in great danger. Mr. Jacob, did Donald Trump ever call the vice president to check on his safety?
He did not.
Mr. Jacob, how did Vice President Pence and Mrs. Pence react to that?
With frustration.
Mr. Jacob, immediately before you and the vice president were evacuated to a secure location within the Capitol, you hit send on an email to John Eastman explaining why his legal theory about the vice president's role was wrong. You ended your email by stating that, quote, "Thanks to your bullshit, we are now under siege." We'll take a look at that email. Now, Dr. Eastman replied, and this is hard to believe, but his reply back to you was, "The siege is because you and your boss," presumably referring to the vice president of the United States, "did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened." Mr. Jacob, later that day, you wrote again to Dr. Eastman. Let's show that email on the screen. In that email, you wrote, and I quote, "Did you advise the president that in your professional judgment, the vice president does not have the power to decide things unilaterally?" And you ended that email saying, "It does not appear that the president ever got the memo." Dr. Eastman then replied, "He's been so advised." And he ends his email with, quote, "But you know him, once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course," close quote. Mr. Jacob, when Dr. Eastman wrote, "Once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course,"
Once he gets something in his head, it's hard for him to change. Is that somebody that sounds like a is that like a mindset? Does that sound like a good mindset for somebody who's like, you know, a presidential candidate? Once they get their mindset on something, it's hard for them to change course.
Did you understand the he in that email to refer to the president of the United States?
I did.
And Mr. Jacob, did you hear from Dr. Eastman further after the riot had been quelled? And if so, what did he ask?
Late that evening, after the joint session had been reconvened, the vice president had given a statement to the nation saying that violence was not going to win, freedom wins, and that the people were going to get back to doing their work. Later that evening, Mr. Eastman emailed me to point out that, in his view, the vice president's speech to the nation violated the Electoral Count Act, that the Electoral Count Act had been violated because the debate on Arizona had not been completed in 2 hours. Of course, it couldn't be since there was an intervening riot of several hours. And that the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act because they hadn't been counted against the debate time. And then he implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the vice president please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days, suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
And we'll show you the text of that email, which Dr. Eastman wrote at 11:44 p.m. on January 6th. So after the attack on the Capitol and after law enforcement had secured the Capitol, he still wrote, as you described, quote, "So now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was previously claimed, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations." So even after the attack on the Capitol had been quelled, Dr. Eastman requested, in writing no less, that the vice president...
Remember, these investigations have been complete. Multiple of them. Actually, multiple times.
violate the law by delaying the certification and sending the question back to the states.
And this is being confirmed by his own allies.
Correct, Mr. Jacob?
And some of his own team members.
Did you eventually share Dr. Eastman's proposal with Vice President Pence?
Not right at that time, because the vice president was completing the work that it was his duty to do. But a day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
And what was Vice President Pence's reaction when you showed him the email where Dr. Eastman, after the attack on the Capitol, still asked that the vice president delay certification and send it back to the states?
He said, that's rubber room stuff.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wood. He said it's rubber room stuff?
Yes, Congressman.
What did you interpret that to mean?
I understood it to mean that after having seen play out what happens when you convince people that there is a decision to be made in the Capitol legitimately about who is to be the president and the consequences of that, that he was still pushing us to do what he had been asking us to do for the previous 2 days, that was certifiably crazy.
We know that the vice president did not do what Dr. Eastman requested because he presided over the completion of the counting of electoral votes late in that evening.
The number of electors appointed to vote for president of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for president of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for vice president of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for vice president of the United States are as follows. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 306 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes. The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes.
Mike Pence should have run for a Republican candidate this time around. That would have been better than Donald Trump again. I wonder if he tried.
On the journals of the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Mr. Jacob, we heard earlier that you and the vice president and the team started January 6th with a prayer. You faced a lot of danger that day. And this is a personal question. But how did your faith guide you on January 6th?
My faith really sustained me through it. I, down in the secure location, pulled out my Bible, read through it, and just took great comfort. Daniel 6 was where I went, and in Daniel 6, Daniel has become the second in command of Babylon, a pagan nation, but he completely faithfully serves. He refuses an order from the king that he cannot follow, and he does his duty, consistent with his oath to God. And I felt that that's what had played out that day.
It spoke to you?
Yes.
At the end of the day, Mark Short sent the vice president a text message with a Bible verse. Here's what he told the select committee.
At 3:50 in the morning, when we finally adjourned and headed our own ways, I remember texting the vice president a passage from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 about I fought the good fight, I finished the race, I've kept the faith.
He started his day with a prayer and ended his day with a Bible verse. I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith. White House attorney Eric Hirschman testified that the next day, January 7th, he received a call from Dr. Eastman. Here is Mr. Hirschman's account of that call.
The day after, Eastman, I don't remember why he called me, or he texted me or called me, wanted to talk with me, and he said he couldn't reach others. And he started to ask me about something dealing with Georgia and preserving something potentially for appeal. And I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on: orderly transition. And I screamed, I said, I don't want to hear any other effing words coming out of your mouth, no matter what, other than orderly transition. Repeat those words to me. And I screamed, eventually he said, orderly transition. I said, good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. Get a great effing criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it. And then I hung up on him.
In fact, just a few days later, Dr. Eastman emailed Rudy Giuliani and requested that he be included on a list of potential recipients of a presidential pardon. Dr. Eastman's email stated, quote, I've decided that I should be on the pardon list, if that is still in the works. Dr. Eastman did not receive his presidential pardon. So let's see what Dr. Eastman did as a result when he was deposed by this committee.
I assert my Fifth Amendment right against being compelled to be a witness against myself.
Did the Trump legal team ask you to prepare a memorandum regarding the vice president's role in the counting of electoral votes at the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021? Okay. Dr. Eastman, did you advise the President of the United States that the vice president could reject electors from 7 states and declare that the president had been reelected? Yep. Dr. Eastman, the first sentence of the memo starts off by saying 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate. Is that statement in this memo true?
Yep.
And President Trump authorized you to discuss publicly your January 4th, 2021 conversation with him.
Okay.
So is it your position that you can discuss in the media direct conversations you had with the President of the United States, but you will not discuss those same conversations with this committee?
Okay.
Dr. Eastman pled the Fifth 100 times. Finally, let's hear from a federal court judge, the only one to date who has opined on whether the president was involved in criminal activity. Page 36 of Judge Carter's ruling says, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds it more likely than not that President Trump corruptly attempted to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. Page 40 of the ruling says, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. And page 44, Dr. Eastman and President Trump launched a campaign to overturn a Democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history. Their campaign was not confined to the ivory tower. It was a coup in search of a legal theory. Mr. Jacob, what would have happened to our democracy if Vice President Pence had gone along with this plan and certified Donald Trump as the winner of the 2020 election?
So there would have been short-term and long-term effects. The short-term I previously described, a constitutional jump ball situation, political chaos in Washington, lawsuits, and who knows what happening in the streets. And you would have had the Vice President of the United States having declared that the outcomes of these state elections were incorrect. So for all of those reasons, there would have been significant short-term consequences. But in the long term, we would have established a situation where a vice president would have asserted that one person could have the authority to determine the outcome of an election, which is antithetical to everything in our democracy. It's antithetical to the rule of law. And so it would have been significant impacts, both in the short and the long term.
Judge Ludig, in the statement you released earlier today, you wrote that the efforts by President Trump...
All right, so that's about the end of that. Let's I'm going to play a really quick clip of what Mike Pence had to say about all this. That salad was really good. Okay.
American people have learned the lessons of that day. They've internalized what they have learned over the last 2 years, including in much of your good work on this topic. They know what happened. They know the fact that the president's reckless words endangered people at the Capitol that day, including me and my family. And I believe they'll factor all of that in as they make decisions going forward in this country. But again, I honestly can tell you that I just think that the American people want leaders in Washington. They want voices in the national debate that are focused on the issues that are affecting their lives. They'll make their own judgment about what happened on January 6th. They'll make their own judgment about this administration and its failures at home and abroad. And I think ultimately history will hold Donald Trump accountable for that day.
Trump actually said, in response to what you've said recently about January 6th, that it was your fault. That if you had done what he was asking you to do, throwing out those electoral votes, you wouldn't have had a January 6th as we know it. That's what he said. What do you think of that? It was your fault. You are to blame.
Well, I know one of the attorneys that was advising the president said the same thing in a text on January the 6th.
Yes.
But his attorneys were wrong, and President Trump is wrong. I know by God's grace we did our duty that day to act out the express language of the Constitution of the United States. States control elections. Once states send electoral votes to the Congress, the only role that the Congress has is to open and count. They can consider objections, which Democrats brought in the last 3 elections that Republicans prevailed. They can consider elections, but at the end of the day, the job of the Congress is to open and count electoral votes certified by the states, no more, no less. We did our duty that day to ensure the peaceful transfer of power under the Constitution of the United States.
I mean, he says, in many ways, you can blame him for January 6th. I mean, you were the one that had to be evacuated.
He's probably thankful that Trump lost.
It was facing calls for people who were saying that they wanted to hang you. And he's saying, in many ways, you can blame him, blame you for January 6th.
Well, it's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that the president and I actually parted amicably when we left the White House on January 20th, and spoke several times in the weeks that followed, that after I saw him return to that type of rhetoric in the spring of 2021, we've just gone our separate ways. I know we did our duty that day. I know the president continues to have a strong difference opinion about my responsibilities that day, but I trust my actions to the judgment of history and the judgment of the American people. I think the people of this country love our Constitution, and they want to see elected officials uphold the Constitution and stand on that foundation. And whatever the future holds for me and my little family, we'll always aspire to do just that.
I want to
Mike
play you
Pence should
something.
have
You
ran
have the
for
video here.
Republican
I want to play you
candidate. What
something
the
Donald
fuck?
Trump said to me when I asked him if he was concerned about your safety on that day. This is a.
Okay, this
asked
is
directly
all kind
about.
of
Were you
subjective
worried
stuff.
about him during that siege? Were you worried about his
No, I
safety?
thought he was well protected, and I had heard that he was in good shape. No, because I had heard he was in very good shape. But no,
You
I
heard
think
those chants. That was terrible. I mean,
he could have. Well, the people were very angry.
they were saying hang Mike
Because
Pence.
it's common sense, John. It's common sense that you're supposed to protect. How can you, if you know a vote is fraudulent, right?
Yeah.
How can you pass on a fraudulent vote to Congress?
I mean, he's effectively justifying or excusing the actions of people who were calling for you to be hanged.
There was no excuse for the violence that took place at the Capitol on January 6th, and I'll never diminish it as long as I live.
So when people are complaining about Republican rhetoric, this
President's
is what
wrong.
they're talking about. And this is
He was
Republican
wrong that
and
day,
Republican
and,
rhetoric, by the way. So
I had actually hoped that he would come around in time, John, that he would see that the cadre of legal advisors that he surrounded himself with had led him astray. But he hasn't done so. And I think it's one of the reasons why the country just wants a fresh start. Our duty is to the Constitution of the United States. Now, there were irregularities in that election. They were reviewed by the courts around the country. States had changed the rules in the election in the name of COVID. And I thought
but
it was.
you don't think the election was stolen? I mean, you said
Look, I think it was worthwhile that the Congress debate the objections and consider the facts and then move forward with the peaceful transfer of power, all under the Constitution and the laws of this country. But at the end of the day, I'll let history be the judge, the American people be the judge, and I'll always know we did our duty that day.
I wish he didn't cut him off. He was
Does
about to
saying
say
of
there was no
justifying
merit.
Those murderous chants. Does the way he's talked about it since?
That the fraud
does
was
that
investigated
effectively
and
disqualify him
nothing came from
for
it.
being commander in chief again? I mean, how? What do you think about that? Could you have somebody that would again justify
Okay,
those
so
chants back in a position of authority?
I think that's a judgment for the American people to make.
What's your judgment about it?
And I'm confident they'll make it. Well, look, I'll be honest with you. I was angry that day. And while I believe in forgiveness, I've been working hard at that for a while. The president let me down that day. He let the country down that day. But thanks to the courage of law enforcement, the riot was quelled. We reconvened the Congress the very same day, and a day of tragedy became a triumph of freedom. And I'll always be proud of our small part in that. But be honest with you, the emotions of that day, the emotion sense, I believe the president may well have brought a claim for that. But I just believe that
During the election, that was one of the other items.
Well, as I said, we're not asserting executive privilege, which may encompass other discussions. I believe the president may well have been there.
Oops.
It's commendable that the United States has provided. May encompass other discussions. I believe the president may well have brought a claim for that. But I just believe that the work that I did preparing for and conducting my role as president of the Senate is covered by the speech and debate clause. I believe we have the law on our side.
But the other issues?
But we'll wait and see on the court.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Because I know that you think big picture, nobody is above the law. I mean, you don't think Donald Trump is above the law.
Nobody's above the law. But nobody's beneath the law either. And the American people are troubled after 4 years of our administration seeing the politicization of the Justice Department. I strongly support the efforts in Congress to investigate the role that politics is playing in our justice system today. And this latest news of the Manhattan DA is determined to apparently bring an indictment against a former president of the United States just feels like one more example of politics being in the lead in our justice system. And that's not what the American people want. We want equal justice before the law, and that's a principle I'll always stand on.
Ukraine is a territorial.
Okay. So here we go. This is gonna be the last video. Regarding Trump's immunity. So for the past like 3 hours, we just went over lots of the evidence. Okay, last night too. Lots of the evidence. Actually, just some of it. But it was, regardless, a lot of evidence that Trump tried to basically scam the election. And commit like an election scheme. Election fraud.
Did he cross? Where did he say it?
He was contacting allies to try to get fraudulent elector slates sent in and certified so that Mike Pence could essentially steal the vote from the people, from the states. And we saw the phone calls, the text messages, the testimonies, the emails, so much. Okay, so now we're going back to this Legal Eagle guy to explain Trump's immunity. And I think this video is super interesting. So we're going to end the night with this video here. Okay. And here we go.
It's worse. Remember when Trump's lawyers argued that he could SEAL Team 6 as political rivals, and we all laughed because that's a preposterous thing for anyone to argue, and absolutely no serious person could possibly believe that the Constitution or the laws of this country would allow that to be the rule. Well, the Supreme Court just said, hold my beer while I assassinate my political rivals.
The president is entitled for total personal gain to use the trappings of his office. That's what you're trying to get us to hold.
Yes, the Supreme Court has effectively given law-breaking presidents, and we're not singling any one law-breaking president out or anything, could be any felonious president, almost absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. And where the court did not grant outright absolute immunity, it gave presumptive immunity and procedural protections that might as well have been absolute immunity. And while unofficial acts of the president still receive no immunity, the crap cherry on top of this crap sundae is that even though a president now has immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts as president, a prosecutor cannot even use official acts as evidence in a prosecution over unofficial acts, which makes prosecution of some unofficial acts virtually impossible. Whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, this is a terrible decision for democracy, possibly a top 5 worst Supreme Court decision of all time. Happy July 4th, everyone! But just how bad is it? Well, don't take my word for it. Justice Sotomayor says, quote, "The court effectively creates a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. This new official acts immunity now lies about like a loaded weapon for any president that wishes to place his own interests, his own political survival, or his own financial gain above the interests of the nation. The president of the United States is the most powerful person in the country, possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way, under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon, immune, 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 immune. Let the president violate the law. Let him exploit the trappings of his office for personal gain. Let him use his official power for evil ends. Because if he knew that he may one day face liability for breaking the law, he might not be as bold and fearless as we would like him to be." That is the majority's message today. Justice Sotomayor concludes that the opinion marked a sea change in the relationship between the people and the president. Quote, "In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law." But how did we get here? Well, until now, executive immunity was a court-created doctrine that shields presidents from most civil lawsuits involving conduct that occurred during their presidential terms. There's no explicit constitutional text granting the president immunity, but in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, the Supreme Court ruled that a president is entitled to absolute immunity from legal liability for civil damages based on his official acts, including acts on the outer perimeter
For civil liability
of his duties. The court defined the president's official duties quite broadly to prevent future presidents from being sued for, quote, "virtually every allegation that an action was unlawful or was taken for a forbidden purpose." The court explained that it was, quote, "settled law that the separation of powers doctrine does not bar every exercise of jurisdiction over the president of the United States. To determine whether a particular type of suit against a president or a former president could be heard, a court must balance the constitutional weight of the interest to be served against the dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch." Indeed, in Clinton versus Jones, the Supreme Court found that under that rubric, the president does not have immunity from civil suits for conduct before they became president. So until now, virtually every lawyer and judge in the country assumed that while executive immunity would shield civil lawsuits because the president could be sued by almost anyone in the country over almost anything, that criminal prosecutions would be different. Why? Because it's way more important that a president be bound by criminal law and not commit heinous criminal acts, even in service of their duties. Plus, there are way more safeguards against criminal prosecution than civil suits. But Trump moved to dismiss his DC prosecution on immunity grounds. He lost at the trial court and appealed the decision. Judge Tanya Chutkan stayed the criminal proceedings pending the outcome of the appeal. The DC Circuit upheld the lower court's ruling that, quote, "former President Trump has become citizen Trump with all the defenses of any other criminal defendant. But any executive immunity that may have protected him while he served as president no longer protects him against this prosecution." The Circuit Court ruled that presidents are not above the law. Immunity that may...
Okay, so for the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has become citizen Trump with all of the defenses of any other criminal defendant, but any executive immunity that may have protected him while he served as president no longer protects him against his prosecution.
They have protected him while he served as president, no longer protects him against this prosecution. The Circuit Court ruled that presidents are not above the law. Quote, "The president has a constitutionally mandated duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. As part of this duty, the president is responsible for investigating and prosecuting criminal violations. It would be a striking paradox if the president, who alone is vested with the constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, were the sole officer capable of defying those laws with impunity." The Circuit Court's decision was widely praised as a well-constructed opinion that came to the only logical conclusion. But then it arrived in the Supreme Court. The top-line ruling from the majority of the Supreme Court is this: presidents cannot be indicted based on conduct for which they are immune from prosecution. Based on the standard that this opinion creates, which we'll talk about in a second, Justice Roberts, writing for the 6th Justice majority, kicked things back down to the trial court. Quote, "On remand, the district court must carefully analyze the indictment's remaining allegations to determine whether they too involve conduct for which a president must be immune from prosecution. And the parties and the district court must ensure that sufficient allegations support the indictment's charges without such conduct." And the opinion starts with the premise that presidents have lots of power, powers they wield exclusively and do not share with Congress. The court describes the president's core powers as taking care that the laws are faithfully executed, commanding the military, and dismissing officers he has appointed and pardoning people who have committed crimes. So the court created 3 buckets: core official acts, non-core official acts, and unofficial acts. But as you'll see, there's very little difference between the official acts, and very little will qualify as an unofficial act. And the court states, quote, "We conclude that under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power requires that a former president have some immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts during his tenure in office. At least with respect to the president's exercise of his core constitutional powers, this immunity must be absolute. As for his remaining official acts, he is also entitled to immunity. At the current stage of proceedings in this case, however, we need not and do not decide whether that immunity must be absolute or instead whether a presumptive immunity is sufficient. So with respect to the exercise of core powers, the president is apparently absolutely immune from any criminal prosecution related to using those powers." And the court goes on to note that in cases involving Richard Nixon and Aaron Burr, judges recognize that the president has a presumptive privilege to withhold certain papers and communications. Though oddly, in both of those cases, Presidents Nixon and Jefferson were compelled to produce records and recordings because of the public interest in those records was strong enough to overcome the presumptive privilege. However, the court sees the Trump case differently because Trump is the subject of a criminal prosecution. Quote, "Criminally prosecuting a president for unofficial conduct undoubtedly poses a far greater threat of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch than simply seeking evidence in his possession, as in Burr and Nixon. The danger is akin to, indeed greater than, what led us to recognize absolute immunity from civil damages liability, that the president would be chilled from taking the bold and unhesitating action required of an independent executive. So the argument goes, if a president could face criminal prosecution for his official acts, including communications with his aides, he might be unable to perform his official duties because he fears prosecution. So the
Why would, oh, happy 1, 2, 3, 4. Happy 1, 2, 3, 4.
What?
Happy 1, 2, 3, 4.
1, 2, 3, 4, baby. Love you.
Sorry. Okay. Happy 1, 2, 3 for everybody. Sorry. I'm corny. I probably just distracted my boyfriend from his game. Okay. What was I gonna say? I distracted myself too. Oh, why would a president's fear of being prosecuted for a crime interfere with his decisions as an executive, as president? I don't understand. Criminal acts shouldn't be a part of your decisions as an executive or as president. So that doesn't make sense to me. If anything, presidents should be very concerned when making executive decisions, whether or not they can be prosecuted for it. Right? Like, yeah, I feel like that should be obvious. No? The fuck?
Court concludes, quote, taking into account these competing considerations, we conclude that the separation of powers principles explicated in our precedent necessitates at least a presumptive immunity from criminal prosecution for a president's acts within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. Such an immunity is required to safeguard the independent and effective functioning of the executive branch and to enable the president to carry out his constitutional duties without undue caution. But what you'll see is that the majority continually only looks to one side. They believe that presidents should be free, but what about the other side? Sure, there are reasons why we want a president to have the ability to take action, but we also have some damn good reasons why we might want the president to hesitate, if not withhold action entirely when it comes to criminal violations. And the majority just simply doesn't address the other side. So the majority sets up a paradigm that first examines whether the conduct involved one of the president's core powers. If it
Alright, this is a good chart. I think he's gonna reference this later.
He ran through the fucking cat.
does, the president is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution. If it does not implicate a core power, then the courts have to decide whether the president's acts are official or unofficial. If it's an official act, the president is presumptively immune from prosecution. If it's an unofficial act, then the president is not immune. So how do we determine if the president's action is part of their core responsibilities or not? Well, we don't know. There's no standard in this opinion. They are apparently, according to this court, whatever powers the president has that are not shared with other branches of the government. But it's not like those powers are just listed in the Constitution. And other than the few powers that were explicitly enumerated by this court, including removing people from office and commanding the military, we have no idea what might be considered a core power or not. But even those enumerated core powers are terrifying, because the court specifically said commanding the military. So if you take one thing away from this video, it's this. Because commanding the military is apparently a core presidential power, and use of core presidential power is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution, any use of the military by the president, including using the American military on American soil, is absolutely immune from criminal prosecution. And if you take two things away, it should be that the president can do anything related to the DOJ, create sham investigations, sham prosecutions, fabricate evidence. They can do any of that, and they are absolutely immune because that's a core function. And a few really good commentators put it this way. The office of the president is like a gun. When you get elected president, you have an unfettered right to use that gun any way that you want to. Your motives and purposes for using that gun are completely irrelevant. You're the president, use a gun however you want. Criminal law does not apply to your use of that gun. And that is why multiple Supreme Court justices are concerned about a president SEAL Team 6ing their political rivals. But some official acts are only presumptively immune. So how would a prosecutor overcome the presumption of immunity that comes with non-core official acts? Well, again, we have no idea. The court doesn't provide a standard. The only thing the court says is that, quote, at a minimum, the president must be immune from prosecution for an official act unless the government can show that applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. This is...
Well, what about, I mean, if the president, or if the person is a former president and he's being prosecuted for acts that he did while he was president, then how would that interfere with the process of being president? It wouldn't. So if anything, you should be able to at least post they should be, you know, criminally liable after the presidency because it wouldn't interfere with any executive act or anything like that.
Barely clearly a limit. There's almost no reason to distinguish between core and non-core official acts if there's no limit on what can be an official act that receives immunity. This language is from the original Fitzgerald balancing test.
And again, what official acts would be obstructed by prosecution if you're not even acting as the official executive anymore? It wouldn't. I mean, I guess they could argue that at the time you would be considering whether or not this act is legal, and therefore that might obstruct it, but a president should be asking that if their actions are legal.
But turned on its head. Instead of balancing the importance of the intrusion, the court simply says if there's any danger at all of intrusion, there is immunity that attaches to that action. As Justice Sotomayor said in her dissent, quote, no dangers, none at all. It is hard to imagine a criminal prosecution for a president's official acts that would pose no dangers of intrusion on presidential authority in the majority's eyes. Nor should that be the standard. Surely some intrusions on the executive may be justified by an overriding need to promote objectives within the constitutional authority of Congress. Other intrusions may be justified by the primary constitutional duty of the judicial branch to do justice in criminal prosecutions. According to the majority, however, any intrusion on executive power is too much. When presumptive immunity is this conclusive, the majority's indecision as to whether official acts immunity must be absolute or whether instead presumptive immunity is sufficient hardly matters. Now, I've seen a few legal pundits say that this decision is no big deal because immunity only attaches absolutely for the exercise of core presidential powers, despite the fact that the military is almost certainly core power and lets the president drone strike their rifle. But it's okay because other official acts are only presumptively immune and therefore can be prosecuted. But based on this language, that's not the case. Given that the only official acts that can be prosecuted are ones where there is absolutely no danger of intrusion into the authority and functions of the executive branch, that category is vanishingly small. Worse, you can't look to the president's motives to determine whether the act was official or not. Now, even if you're president and you murder your political rivals and receive protection, you'll still want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. The workers' comp, you can get the best. Well, hold on. First, team. So click below. Okay, sure. But unofficial acts are not immune, right?
Here's that chart.
Well, hold on. First, how would we distinguish a president's official actions from his unofficial ones? Well, the court says, quote, when the president acts pursuant to constitutional and statutory authority, he takes official action to perform the functions of his office. However, the court then says that official acts are not constrained to the president's constitutional and statutory authority. The majority says, quote, and some presidential conduct, for example, speaking to and on behalf of the American people, certainly can qualify as official conduct when not obviously connected to a particular constitutional or statutory provision. For those reasons, the immunity we have recognized extends to the outer perimeter of the president's official responsibilities, covering actions so long as they are not manifestly or palpably beyond his authority. So if you think that sounds like a very broad description of presidential official acts, you'd be right. I would be challenged to come up with a broader definition. But surely plotting to overturn an election result would be manifestly and palpably beyond the president's authority, right? Wrong. The Supreme Court said, quote, in dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. According to Roberts, even
The court may not inquire into the president's motives. This is giving the executive branch just a totally unchecked power. An imbalance.
asking the question would cripple the executive branch's ability to function. And it gets worse. According to Justice Roberts, quote, nor may courts deem an action unofficial merely because it allegedly violates a generally applicable law. So if a president's action violates a law, that doesn't mean he can be prosecuted.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
As Justice Jackson points out in her dissent, the government will have difficulty proving whether an act is official or unofficial since it can't introduce evidence of the president's motives. That's right, the court says you can't look to the president's motives to determine whether an act is official or unofficial either. You know, for reasons. The only question is whether the president has the power or not. And Justice Jackson points out the problem with this means-only or authority-only approach in her dissent in a footnote. She says, quote, to fully appreciate the oddity of making the criminal immunity determination turn on the character of the president's responsibilities, consider what the majority says is one of the president's conclusive and preclusive prerogatives, the president's power to remove those who wield executive power on his behalf. While the president may have the authority to decide to remove the attorney general, for example, the question here is whether the president has the option to remove the attorney general by, say, poisoning him to death. Put another way, the issue here is not whether the president has exclusive removal power, but whether a generally applicable criminal law prohibiting murder can restrict how the president exercises that authority.
Okay, so pause right here. I'm going to read this again, okay? While the president may have the authority to decide to remove the attorney general, for example, which is what Trump was threatening to do in 2020, when he had his buddy call the attorney general and said, hey, Trump just offered me this position, your position, unless you sign these fake elector certifications. So will you certify them? And then if you do that, I won't take Donald Trump's offer to fill your position as Attorney General. So, while the president may have the authority to decide to remove the Attorney General, for example, the question here is whether the president has the option to remove the Attorney General by, say, poisoning him to death. Put another way, the issue here is not whether the president has exclusive removal power, but whether a general applicable criminal law prohibiting murder can restrict how the president exercises that authority. So, in other words, because removing an attorney general is part of is like an official act that's part of the president, or like an official act that the president can do. Like the president can decide who is attorney general. They can fire the attorney general, etc. That is a executive act. How the president decides to remove that attorney general, including by murdering him, this decision can restrict how do they word it? How the president exercise. Okay, so this decision can restrict the law from, investigating or questioning the president's motives and giving him immunity for this act, because removing the attorney general is an official act that the president has, a power that the president has. So it's a power that the president has. So is removing the attorney general. So how he removes the attorney general, because it is a power the president has, his motives can't be turned in, questioned legally, and it could be protected by immunity because it's an act the president has the power to do. That's what this judgment is saying.
And the implied answer in that footnote is that the president is free to poison any member of their staff or cabinet because they have authority to remove that person. They've got the power, so any means whatsoever would be an official act. And I'm not being histrionic here. Justice Sotomayor says the majority allows the president to send SEAL Team 6 to kill their political rival. Justice Jackson says the majority allows the president to poison any member of their staff. This isn't just me. These are the dissenting justices on the Supreme Court. This is what I meant when I said this was bad. And this policy argument on which they 100% rely stems from the idea of separation of powers. But it also turns that idea completely on its head, because part of separation of powers is checks and balances. And here, they've organized things in a way that the executive is completely unchecked by either of the other branches of government. And while the majority opinion is 43 pages long, it never got around to defining unofficial acts. So while it provides tons of guidance on what is an official act and is therefore immune from prosecution, they give zero guidance whatsoever on what is an unofficial act and therefore would be prosecutable. All we know is that official acts which are immune are anything within the outer perimeter of the president's official responsibilities, covering actions so long as they are not manifestly or palpably beyond his authority. That's almost anything a president does. So the court has also made the official versus unofficial distinction almost meaningless. As Justice Sotomayor says, in fact, the majority's dividing line between official and unofficial conduct narrows a conduct considered unofficial almost to a nullity. It says that whenever the president acts in a way that is not manifestly or palpably beyond his authority, he's taking official action. It then goes a step further. In dividing official from unofficial conduct, courts may not inquire into the president's motives. It is one thing to say that motive is irrelevant to questions regarding the scope of civil liability, but it is quite another to make it irrelevant to questions regarding criminal liability. Under that rule, any use of official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt purpose indicated by objective evidence of the most corrupt motives and intent, remains official and immune. Under the majority's test, if it can be called a test, the category of presidential action that can be deemed unofficial is destined to be vanishingly small. So to help understand all these distinctions, the great people over at Justice Security put together this great chart. Starting from right to left, if there is official conduct, we have to ask, is it within the core constitutional authority? If it is, there's absolute immunity, no prosecution.
Okay, so here's the chart, right? So, type of conduct. Start at the top. Official conduct versus unofficial conduct. And by conduct, we mean actions that the president takes. So, official actions would be, actions that the president takes to fulfill their job as president. Conclusive and preclusive core constitutional authority? Yes. absolute immunity, no prosecution, no use of evidence. Example, POTUS pressure on Department of Justice investigations and prosecutions. So, if it is an official conduct, with core constitutional, that the president has core constitutional authority over, like removing an attorney general, then they have absolute immunity. And none of these actions can be used as evidence for unofficial conduct investigations. Okay. If it's not a conclusive or preclusive core constitutional authority, they get presumptive immunity. Pose any dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive. So, if it poses any dangers or of intrusion on the authority and functions, the powers of the president, if it's yes, no prosecution, no use of evidence again. And then if it's no, yes prosecution, and yes use as evidence. So for example, it says, example, fuck, I can't read it.
And you can't use it as evidence. If it's not
Possibly pressure on former Vice President Mike Pence. So that's why they were allowed to use the pressure of Mike Pence in these hearings that we just heard about. And then back to the top, type of conduct. Unofficial conduct. Yes, you can prosecute it. For example, possibly false elector scheme, possibly a lips speech. But again, everything over here can't be used as evidence to prosecute anything over here, any unofficial conduct. So this evidence can't be used in this investigation. And again, he's probably about to explain this like better than I am.
core constitutional authority, you have to ask, does it pose any danger of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch? If it does, no prosecution, can't use it as evidence. If it doesn't pose any dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch, then there is no immunity and you can use it as evidence in a prosecution. Then going back up to the top of the chart, if the conduct is 100% unofficial, then yes, you can prosecute it. But remember, you cannot use any official acts or anything that was deemed an official act as evidence in that particular trial. Now, when courts address constitutional questions, they're generally bound by principles of judicial restraint. Now, the consequences of this decision are not just about Trump. It applies to all presidents for the foreseeable future. And that's why it's important to understand the criticisms of this decision and why it's so dangerous. So let's start with one of the court's first big leaps, the idea that immunity shields a president from criminal as well as civil penalties. Why did the majority grant such sweeping immunity? Well, according to the majority, quote, the purpose of a vigorous and energetic executive, the framers thought, was to ensure good government, for a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. They pull that line out of context from Federalist 70, and that's about it. You apparently can't have any enfeeblement whatsoever of the president, even though every president for the last 250 years has assumed they could be criminally liable for at least some of their conduct. But that's it. That's all the support they have. It's just a policy argument that a vigorous, unencumbered presidency is good, therefore almost full.
So again, it should be very alarming going forward for whoever, for every future president. And that includes Trump. And especially because this was his judgment for his immunity. So he's aware of all this power now that he has.
Immunity. QED. From proclaimed originalist and textualist, this is honestly shockingly dishonest and hypocritical. Because we're dealing with the Constitution, Congress can't pass a law that says the president will be criminally liable for virtually anything, and the judiciary can't prosecute the president, so the president is unchecked. And the majority opinion doesn't even address the public's interest in not having a criminal president. As Justice Sotomayor points out in her dissent, the court's precedent suggests that presidents do not and should not have broad immunity from criminal law. Quote, at the same time, the public interest in federal criminal prosecution of a former president is vastly greater than the public interest in a private individual's civil suit. All 9 justices in Fitzgerald explicitly recognized that distinction. The 5-justice majority noted that there was a greater public interest in criminal prosecutions than in actions for civil damages. Chief Justice Berger's concurrence accordingly emphasized that the majority's immunity was limited to civil damages claims rather than criminal prosecution. The 4 dissenting justices agreed that a contention that the president is immune from criminal prosecution in the courts, if ever made, would not be credible. And the ramifications of declaring the president above criminal law are huge. Justice Jackson explains, quote, put simply, immunity is exemption from the duties and liabilities imposed by law. In its purest form, the concept of immunity boils down to a maxim, the king can do no wrong, a notion that was firmly rejected at the birth of our republic. And as Justice Sotomayor explains, quote, the majority makes 3 moves that in effect completely insulate presidents from criminal liability. First, the majority creates absolute immunity for the president's exercise of core constitutional powers. This holding is unnecessary on the facts of the indictment, and the majority's attempt to apply it to the facts expands the concept of core powers beyond any recognizable bounds. In any event, it is quickly eclipsed by the second move, which is to create expansive immunity for all official acts. Whether described as presumptive or absolute under the majority's rule, a president's use of any official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt, is immune from prosecution. That is just as bad as it sounds, and it is baseless. Finally, the majority declares that evidence concerning acts for which the president is immune can play no role in any criminal prosecution against him. That holding, which will prevent the government from using a president's official acts to prove knowledge or intent in prosecuting private offenses, is nonsensical. Argument by argument, the majority invents immunity through brute force. Under scrutiny, its arguments crumble. To start, the majority's broad official acts immunity is inconsistent with text, history, and established understandings of the president's role. Moreover, it is deeply wrong even in its own functionalist terms. Next, the majority's core immunity is both unnecessary and misguided. Furthermore, the majority's illogical evidentiary hearings is unprecedented. Finally, this majority's project will have disastrous consequences for the presidency and for our democracy. The main takeaway of today's decision is that all of a president's official acts, defined without regard to motive or intent, are entitled to immunity that is at least presumptive and quite possibly absolute. Whenever the president wields the enormous power of his office, the majority says the criminal law, at least presumptively, cannot touch him. The official act immunity has no firm grounding in constitutional text, history, or precedent. Indeed, those standard grounds for constitutional decision-making all point in the opposite direction. No matter how you look at it, the majority's official acts immunity is utterly indefensible. Now, the 6 conservatives in the majority, all of them self-described strict textualists, were really offended by this comment. They say that, quote, a specific textual basis has not been considered a prerequisite to the recognition of immunity. And Justice Roberts tries to rebut Sotomayor by noting that the Constitution is silent on all matters related to prosecuting ex-presidents. Quote, conspicuously absent is a mention of the fact that since the founding, no president has ever faced criminal charges, let alone for his conduct in office. But that's entirely Sotomayor's point. She says the Constitution's silence is noteworthy in at least 3 respects. Quote, first, the framers clearly knew how to provide for immunity from prosecution because they did give narrow immunity to legislators via the speech or debate clause. She says, quote, they did not extend the same or similar immunity to presidents. This is classic textual interpretation. If you're bound by the Constitution and the Constitution grants immunity in some places, but is silent as to immunity in other places, that immunity doesn't exist. Her second point is that some state constitutions did provide express immunity for sitting governors, but the Constitution did not. Again, calling into question the reason the framers did not extend that privilege to a sitting president. And the third contention was that the impeachment judgment clause cut against the court's position. Quote, that clause presumes the availability of criminal process as a backstop by establishing that an official impeached and convicted by the Senate shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, and judgment and punishment according to law. That clause clearly contemplates that a former president may be subject to criminal prosecution for the same conduct that resulted or could have resulted in an impeachment judgment, including conduct such as bribery. So there's no other way to put this. This is a horrifying opinion. And I personally worry about the future of this country. For one reason, we can't change this. There's no one to appeal to. Congress can't fix this with legislation. We can't appeal to the courts because the highest court in the land says that the immunity exists and it's almost always absolute. The Constitution is the highest law of the land, and it's effectively like the Supreme Court has amended the Constitution to include an immunity that has never existed before with zero basis in the text and history of the Constitution. All we can do is hope that future presidents won't use this power. This is horrifying not only for those that think former President Trump committed crimes while in office, but for anyone that believes the president should be bound by the law. As of today, for many actions, regardless of their inherent criminality, the president is immune. And even if you believed every crazy thing that has been alleged about Biden and the Biden crime family, this decision would immunize almost every allegation that has been levied against them. And of course, the shadow of Trump's actions looms large, but I wouldn't want this opinion to come down during any presidency. Nor does any serious jurist think that this should be the law going forward. No president should have this immunity. No president should have this power. And perhaps someday the Supreme Court will scale back this opinion and provide reasonable definitions. But as it stands now, current and future presidents have the powers of a king. So yeah, this is bad, and I frankly...
Okay, so that's that. So there we have it. So now I've put together like 6 hours, actually over 6 hours of January 6th content. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or on purpose that my first open panels, you know, that were set up to debate this topic that people were so hyped to debate me previously, no one showed up. So maybe it's a coincidence. I don't know. But yeah, there's that. I think it's pretty clear. The immunity is not the gotcha or the win that people think it is. I think this is all pretty obvious and clear. I asked for people to send in contradicting evidence. Nobody did. I opened up the panel to debate me. Nobody showed up. So there you have it. My next stream is gonna go back to the gender wars stuff. It's actually gonna be a sex work debate topic. When Andrew Wilson was on the whatever podcast recently, like a couple days ago, debating sex work. We're gonna talk about that. So yeah, maybe it's just the timing. I'm open to having a discussion about January 6th with the people who were debating me in the comments about it last week another time. Maybe they just couldn't make it tonight or something. I don't know. But I tried. I showed my evidence. All 6+ hours of it. So anyways, please like the stream and consider subscribing if you haven't already.
You win, GG.
And I will see you guys next time.
The glory, Molly.